Good morning, everybody. Welcome again to session 2, day 2. I think we probably lack one more to have. I believe we have a quorum now, but nothing to vote on, so we'll go ahead and proceed. First of all, Cliff, you have some introductions to make, I believe.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I would just like everyone to welcome our intern this summer. We have Diana Pope, who's joining us. Hey, Diana's from Franklin, Tennessee, and she's a sophomore at Bryn Mawr College and has been with us since the start of this month and has been making a tremendous contribution already. Would also like to say we have a second intern who's going to be joining us later this summer, but is not with us yet, and that's Christine Freeland. Christine is in the MPA program, Masters of Public Administration program at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Among her other experience, she was a legislative intern for Chairman Watson last year. So we look forward to having her on staff later this summer. Thank you, Vice Chairman.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you, Representative Wargo, for the good cooking again this morning. We gratefully appreciate that. Current water supply issues in Tennessee. This is an update. Lanice, welcome back. Welcome back home. We're glad you're here. Mike Bernard, Principal South Smith's Seckman Reed Incorporated, and Louis B. Jones, partner of King and Spalding. I understand this will be a 3-person panel. So if you'll please come up and take your seats, lady and gentlemen. And Lanice, you need no introduction, but please let us know who you are again, and each of you introduce yourselves, and then go ahead and proceed.
I'm Lanice Rorick-Patrick. I'm Senior Public Policy Consultant for TACIR.
I'm Mike Bernard. I'm a principal with Smith Seckman Reed in our infrastructure program here in Nashville.
And I'm Louis Jones. I'm a partner at King and Spalding. I'm from Atlanta, and I've been representing the Consolidated Utilities District of Rutherford County and City of Murfreesboro on their issues with the Corps of Engineers at J. Percy Priest, which we'll talk about shortly.
Good. Thank you. Lanice?
With your indulgence, if I could go to the podium for my presentation, is that okay? Thank you. How do I turn the microphone on? I'm on? Ah, good. This is an update of the report that Cliff gave on my behalf in January on several issues that keep recurring in Tennessee. Actually, we had a couple of bills involved or related to these issues this year. Generally speaking, these are issues that just continue to recur and have public policy implications all across the state, but they vary from region to region. And in fact, we have 3 examples of how different the regions of Tennessee are in terms of water supply. Mike Bernard, principal with Smith Seckman Reed, is here today to give us a little bit of a rundown on what happened in southeast Tennessee this year. On the Cumberland Plateau, there was a drought very late in the year that caused severe problems for several utilities in that region. The governor and TDEC and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers got involved with that, and you'll get more of an update, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview of that to introduce the issue. There's a recurring issue with water storage allocation and accounting on J. Percy Priest, where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers controls the water supply use. And some of that relates to the nuances of federal law, the authorization for that reservoir, and it's an example of issues that can arise in other Corps of Engineers reservoirs across the state. It just happens to be rearing its head here in Middle Tennessee because of the immense population growth. And also, Percy Priest is one of the smallest, if not the smallest, on the Cumberland River system of the reservoirs. It looks like a really huge lake, but relative to the size of other lakes, and certainly relative to the population here, it's not very big. And then there's the issue that's been going on for a long time in the Memphis area, controversy over the sand aquifer there, and a claim by the state of Mississippi that the city of Memphis, that their light, gas, and water, I think I've got that in the right order, entity has been pulling more water from the aquifer than is actually under the city of Memphis or into the state of Tennessee, and actually reducing the water availability in the city of Memphis. That lawsuit was first filed against the city of Memphis, and federal district court in Mississippi transferred it to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying this is really a case between states, and cases between states go directly to the Supreme Court, where they have your original jurisdiction over controversies between states. The Memphis Sand Aquifer is a pretty amazing resource. It's been called the sweetest water in the world. And I read recently that the city of Memphis is one of the largest cities in the world that relies on groundwater for its water supply. It's not hard to understand then why there is why it's such an asset for the Memphis area and that entire region, not just Memphis and Tennessee, but also Arkansas and Mississippi as well. And as that region grows, the issues like this are going to continue to come up. There's a lot that we don't know about how aquifers respond to water withdrawals and recharges and so forth. And to better understand that, the University of Memphis has a groundwater institute. It's unique in the state. Excuse me, West Tennessee relies much more on groundwater than the rest of the state does, almost entirely. And the reason for that is its availability there, but also that it's much easier to treat because it's filtered. Much of this is water that's been in the ground for thousands of years, maybe millions of years, and as it recharges, it's filtered through sand, and it's much cleaner when it's drawn back out. Even though you might think, those of us who didn't know much about this might think, why not pull water from the Mississippi River? It's huge. Well, there are massive treatment issues with that as well. So two issues that one issue with Memphis and Mississippi has been there for a long time. But another issue came about this year, and you got some information about that back in January, and I won't go over that in depth now, but it had to do with TVA getting permission from TDEC to drill some wells in the area and concern about the possibility of pollution there, and a feeling that the city of Memphis, through its water utility, could provide the water that was necessary. And so a lot of different organizations, it's kind of an amazing array of groups that came together to agree that something needed to be done about that. And in fact, we had a bill introduced this year, and I've got links to these things in this presentation, so when they're put online, people will be able to pull those up. But a bill to establish a sort of a watchdog group that would be of appointed officials to oversee who gets to drill wells in that area. It was sponsored in the Senate by Senator Kelsey and Senator Harris, and by Representative Lawler in the House of Representatives. The Commercial Appeal supported it, Memphis Light Water and Gas supported it, the Sierra Club supported it. It had a lot of support. It has not moved. The bill was introduced, passed on first consideration, but was not calendared this year. And you've got some materials in your docket book and online that describe the situation down there. But my purpose today is simply to point out that that is an issue, and that it may become a greater issue over time as the population grows there and the demand increases. The issue with TVA came about because they needed the water to cool a new gas-fired power plant that they're putting down there to replace the existing power plant. And I've sort of done this chart in reverse. The big question with Mississippi is captured there at the top, whether the wells serving the city of Memphis have altered the flow of water in the Memphis Sand Aquifer. The Memphis Sand Aquifer is actually part of a larger aquifer system that stretches all the way up to Illinois, I believe, and well down into the state of Mississippi and across under the Mississippi River into the state of Arkansas. Again, these are issues that are going to continue to raise their heads. Right now, there's a special master appointed by the U.S. Supreme Court that's in charge of the case that was brought by Mississippi. The special master agreed with Tennessee that there's no enforceable right to unapportioned groundwater in the aquifer, and only the Supreme Court can apportion groundwater between states, and that hasn't been done yet. But that raises the factual question whether the aquifer is even an interstate resource at all. And so they got the parties to agree to engage in some discovery that would help them reveal the facts related that they would need to make that decision and develop a plan for a hearing on that question, which is to the plan is due in August of 2017. So you can see this is a very multi-year process that we're going to go through even to get that issue resolved, and it's important to keep an eye on it as it proceeds through the court. It could lay the groundwork for, it could be a precedent-setting decision depending on how it comes out. To shift now to Middle and East Tennessee, issues there are driven more by drought than anything else, and then population growth laying over that in areas like Middle Tennessee. We all remember the 2007-2008 drought. It is known as the worst on record in Tennessee. We may have a little dispute about that, looking back at the records through the process that the Corps of Engineers and others have gone through in studying Percy Priest Reservoir, but as of now, that's considered to be the worst drought on record. And just a recap of some of the things that happened as a result of that. Everybody with an interest in water supply or responsibility related to water supply became engaged in the wake of that drought to improve the drought planning and the ability to manage through drought all across the state. The state of Tennessee, through its Department of Environment Conservation, created a new drought management plan. And let me get back caught up there. Somehow I had triggered a link in that chart. And this is a list of the materials that are available online about what the state's Water Resources Technical Advisory Committee put together over the course of about 3 or 4 years, starting in 2009, maybe more like 5 years. I think we finished up that work in 2014. There are all kinds of planning publications, reports on the 2 pilot studies that have been presented to you in the past. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is also was engaged throughout that entire process. They were part of that team along with the U.S. Geological Survey, state and local officials from other agencies. And it was a very robust look at the issues related to not just drought management, but also managing water supply on a regional basis. And the major outcome of it, other than in addition to the drought management plan, was to create a framework for regional water supply planning. And that becomes a real issue when we're looking at the Cumberland Plateau area, the small utilities there, and the challenges that they repeatedly face because they sit at the top of a watershed, and their water supply is always going to be limited as a result of that. It becomes very important for them to work together on solutions, and Mr. Bernard is going to talk more about and give you a great overview of an example of how that is proceeding. And Corps of Engineers is in. We're going to have more of a discussion, a deep discussion of the issues that have been raised separately through in relation to the Corps of Engineers and some of the things that they're doing as a result of the water supply study that's going on at Percy Priest right now, and a proposed rule that would establish, that is the Corps' attempt to establish a consistent way of handling storage accounting, particularly in droughts, that has an interesting little twist to it that led to a change in state law. We'll talk about that. So just a little overview about Percy Priest Reservoir. It was authorized. This is kind of an example of how these things are done. It was authorized but not funded in the Federal Flood Control Act of 1938. It was originally commissioned in the Federal Flood Control Act of 1946. It wasn't until, well, in the 1958 its name was changed, but it wasn't until 1963 that construction actually began. The 1958 change that changed the bill in 1958 that changed the name of the project and to honor a congressman from Nashville, James Percy Priest, also finally funded the project. The gates were closed in 1968, and the lake filled. Its original purposes were flood control, hydropower, and recreation. Since then, the Corps, through other authorization, has added fish and wildlife as a water quality issue for excuse me. Related, has a recreation component as well as just a general environmental component, water quality in general in terms of water supply and water supply itself. The Water Supply Act of 1958 authorizes the Secretary of the Army to include water storage in Corps projects and reallocate storage in existing projects to municipal and industrial water supply. This reallocation process is the big issue on Percy Priest right now and has been since the late 1990s. For a long time, the utilities, which include Smyrna, the city of Smyrna, city of Murfreesboro, and the Consolidated Utility District of Rutherford County, just had intakes either in the case of Smyrna, in the part of Stones River that actually was flooded by Percy Priest, and in the case of Murfreesboro, initially well upstream of the lake, but they have a second intake, and we have Mr. Darren Gore here, who is the general manager for the for Murfreesboro Water and Sewer, who can answer questions about that. We also have the general manager from Consolidated Utility District, Bill Dunnill, sitting next to him. And they will be happy to correct any misstatements that I may make in the process of giving you this overview. Murfreesboro, since that time, has added an intake farther downstream. The city, the CUD has an intake in the headwaters of Percy Priest. But until the early part of this century, it wasn't that big of an issue. The Corps of Engineers notified the city of Smyrna, I guess, that they were going to charge them for storage in the lake. The whole issue of storage in the lake for water supply purposes started coming up in the early 2000s. And let me just kick over to this slide that kind of walks through that process. A reallocation study began in 1997, and it was approved in 2002. And I've got some notations up here of the population growth in the area just to give you an idea of how this whole issue has become more important over time. In 1990, the population of the entire county of Rutherford was less than 120,000. By 2000, it had grown to over 180,000. Through the reallocation study that was done on Priest at that time, water storage agreements were executed from 2003 to 2008 with those three utilities. By 2005, the population of the county was well over 220,000. We had the record drought in 2007 and 2008. The Corps went back and refined its model, recalculated the yield of the storage that each of those utilities had secured through their contracts in that lake, the amount of water that they would supply, and notified them that it was far less than what they thought when they executed those contracts. Now, you're growing rapidly, your water needs are growing rapidly, and you're notified by the Corps of Engineers that you don't have as much water as you thought you had in the first place. Consolidated Utility District of Rutherford County has been experiencing most of the growth in the customer base in the county. And they're the one that has been most affected by this change. And I should disclose at this point that as of last December, thank you, Mayor Burgess, I am a voting member of the Board of Consolidated Utility District. So it's important that you know that, because I'm partly speaking, it's impossible for me not to speak on behalf of them, but also as a 5 or 6 year member of the state's Water Resources Technical Advisory Committee and someone who has worked closely with TDEC, the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Geological Survey, and those agencies. I admire their professionalism. I feel like I'm standing right in the middle of that most of the time. And apologies to Darren and Bill for that. But so I stand before you right now as someone, I think, who's a little circumspect about the controversies in this arena, and a little more or less biased than you might think, given my current role. So the CUD in particular had what they thought was a contract that was going to secure 16 million gallons per day. They were told, as a result of the initial work that the Corps did in this reallocation study, that it was more like 10. Is that accurate, Bill? And this is at a time when they're looking at a need for up to 30 or more. Fortunately, partly as a result of drought, partly as a result of trends in the whole industry of appliance, just everything related to people's awareness of overusing their water supply. We've got much more water efficient appliances and so forth. We actually are experiencing all across the nation less water usage per household than we did 10 or 20 years ago. As a result of that and other efficiencies, reduction in water losses through improvements in the water system, the Consolidated Utility District has been able to keep up with population growth so far, but they've kind of hit a wall. And so this issue has become extremely important. So there was a request for a new reallocation study in 2008. The needs assessment was initiated in 2009. Mr. Gore and Mr. Dunnill have both provided, as well as the City of Smyrna, have all provided considerable information to the Corps of Engineers about what they expect their population growth and their customer base and their water supply needs to be. The Corps of Engineers has done extensive analysis of this. Along with Mr. Jones with King and Spalding, has along with that contract is a contract with a group called Hydrologics that does modeling of water supply resources such as Percy Priest. And again, kind of a full disclosure thing, they were also on the team with the Water Resources Technical Advisory Committee. So I knew who they were before that point. They're highly regarded. TDEC adopted their OASIS model for water supply management and made it available to all the utilities in the state. So they're part of the process, and they were scrutinizing the work of the Corps of Engineers and making sure that the model truly reflected what everyone could agree to. This process has been going on, as you can see, for almost 10 years now. A draft reallocation report and water storage agreements were released in April of 2016. They've been under discussion with the utilities ever since for more than a year. And we're still a long way away from resolution of those. However, there has been sufficient agreement on the population projections, the water supply needs, and now even agreement on the, for the most part, on the model and what the model is saying the various amounts of storage will generate from it, that CUD has been able to secure from TDEC approval, long-needed approval to expand its water plant, which has been the biggest issue of all. So Mr. Jones is going to speak more to that process and a lot of the issues that are related that process has brought up. And here this slide kind of recaps the gist of it. Starting down at the bottom, in April of this year, Governor Haslam signed into law Public Chapter 220, which established the right of anyone who has a water shortage contract with the Corps, like these utilities in water storage contract, like these utilities on JPP, to their right to return flows that they make to the reservoir. This was an issue in calculating the amount of water that the utilities would have in storage during a drought, which is where the rub really comes. The Corps of Engineers, hop up to the top bullet there, through a rule that was proposed and put out for comment in last December, was going to update and clarify policies governing the use of reservoirs for water supply, including defining key terms. And some of the key terms were those involved in determining how much water you actually had in storage during a drought. And entitlement to these return flows is a huge issue. And it's an issue that plays out differently in states all across the country because of differences in their climate and differences in their water laws. Their water laws are a reflection of their climate. And so Mr. Jones can also speak to a group that's been formed of states and utilities and regional organizations like the Atlanta Regional Commission all across the country that have come together to try to get a sensible approach established and ensure that while the Corps is trying to gain consistency across the country, that consistency doesn't become an impediment to proper water supply management in each region because of those differences. So, you can be overly consistent if you're not careful. So one of those key terms is the right to those return flows. And Murfreesboro is the best example we have in this region of where that is an issue. When the Corps, you contract with the Corps for an amount of storage, not an amount of water. The Corps calculates during a drought how much water there actually is and the amount of storage that you've calculated for. It's a formula that takes into account a whole lot of things. One of the things that right now it doesn't take into account is the amount of water that, for instance, Murfreesboro Water and Sewer returns to the system. That water that amount of water is used to estimate how much water there is in the reservoir as a whole, but Murfreesboro Water and Sewer doesn't get to offset the amount of water it withdraws with the amount of water that it returns. And so you get a big difference in the result for when you are reaching the bottom of the barrel for your water supply, at which point you trigger a system that we've never even had happen yet, where TDEC would come into play and have to decide how to handle the water allocation among the systems. It's interesting and complicated and seems nonsensical in some ways. If you've got several systems that are pulling water from the same reservoir and the storage as a whole hasn't been overdrawn, then why is anybody in trouble? And it's because of these arcane ways of calculating what has to be calculated in order for the Corps of Engineers to determine how much it has to charge each utility for its storage. So if you're using more water than your part of the contracted storage includes, then you're dipping into somebody else's pot and they're paying for something that you're benefiting from and they're not getting the benefit of it. So a lot of it is about balancing that out. Well, they're also balancing it out in terms of the other demands on that water supply. Here in Nashville, we've become more aware, I think, of water supply issues in the last 10 years than a lot of other places because of the back-to-back problems of 1 year an extremely severe drought, and then 3 years later, an extremely severe flood. Corps of Engineers has a very difficult balancing act to play in trying to make sure that they are managing each of the reservoirs properly to allow for flood control, and yet maintaining enough water in those reservoirs for water supply. So over the winter, they draw down, because our big rains are primarily in the spring. They draw down the reservoirs, and Percy Priest is a perfect example of this. They draw the reservoir down in order to receive the spring rains from upstream. Well, if the spring rains don't come, if you have a dry spring, and we've had a relatively dry spring this year, fortunately, May rains solve that problem. The lake doesn't come back up to the level that it needs to be and that it's supposed to be by agreement for recreation, for water quality, and for water supply at the time of the year when our water supply demands are greatest, during the summer. So there's this tension there, and that when you're on the water supply side of it, it's hard to understand why they don't just allow the lake to fill up when the lake fills up. It's also hard to understand when the lake is within a foot of its guide curve, its level that it's supposed to be at for any particular time in the year. Why are we out of water? The boats are still floating, the fish are still swimming, and there's still water flowing through the dam. They're actually discharging water through the dam. Why is there not enough water for us? So these are controversies that are going to continue, and I think we're probably not going to fully resolve the issue with the change in the proposed rule, or even with the change in law, particularly in this area because of the crazy rapid growth we're experiencing. So, and just to give you an idea, this is, it's been said that drought recurs with some intensity in Tennessee at least once every 5 years. We've been talking about the 07-08 drought. That first big spike on the left right there is the 2012 drought, right on time, 5 years after that one. The big spike on the right is from fall of 2016 and into late fall of 2016 and into the winter. So this graph kind of backs up that claim that it occurs once every 5 years. So in another 5 years, we're going to be due again. By that time, we're going to have a lot more people living in this region. In the meantime, you've got a lot of people living in that Cumberland Plateau area, again at the top of the watersheds, where headwaters, where the water supply is very small. This is, despite that, let me back up one slide, that massive tall spike there in sort of started in October, lasted into December. By January, the drought was almost gone, and you can see just a little bit the southern part of Polk, Bradley, and Hamilton counties were still in the extreme drought range, but the rest of the state was pretty well recovered, including the area that had the biggest problem. Now, if you're in those areas right there, you've got the Tennessee River, the Ocoee River, the Hiwassee River, not as bad, but if you're up on the plateau, those are not available to you, at least with current. This is a list of more than 20 utilities that were affected by declining source problems in that period and were on restrictions in January 27 imposed by TDEC. Even Murfreesboro Water and Sewer is on that list. If you get a chance, there's a link for the Oneida system that takes you to a spot that WBIR out of Knoxville produced that will give you an idea of what it's like to be in one of these little places during this drought. I'm not going to take time right now to show it. It's about 2 minutes long, but it will help you understand how big this problem really is. And again, it happens over and over and over. Maybe not in the same utility, but in some utilities all the time. TDEC actually asked customers of 10 utilities in six southeastern counties listed here, it's 10 utilities, to limit their water usage last October, and 7 were still on the restriction list in January when this organization had its meeting. You see the list there. So several of those utilities, their representatives in local government and in state government came to meet with Governor Haslam to ask for relief. And Governor Haslam directed TDEC to organize meetings with those utilities and the Corps of Engineers to try to identify a way forward to resolve those issues. I'm going to let Mr. Bernard talk about how they handled that drought at that time. It was an amazing thing that they were able to do to relieve the drought that was particularly affecting the Fall Creek Falls Utility District and the city of Pikeville. The city of Pikeville was actually, which city of Pikeville relies on wells. It's close to the Sequatchie River, and to survive through this period, it actually had a line overland into the Sequatchie River. They did something a little bit more interesting with the Fall Creek Falls Utility District. City of Pikeville serves the Bledsoe County Correction Facility, and the Fall Creek Falls Utility is dependent for its water treatment on the Taft water treatment plant. Taft is no longer a correctional facility, but that water treatment plant still exists. Dependent on a very small reservoir known as Bee Creek, which I think was lower than anyone had ever seen it, and ended up working through a system that Mr. Bernard will describe to pull water from the Fall Creek Falls Lake at the park up there. So the National Weather Service was, I kind of opened the meeting, the first meeting of that's a series of meetings that Governor Haslam had asked for in December of last year, saying that Chattanooga was on pace in fall of 2016 for the driest year on record, worse than the drought of record for us, for the state as a whole, the 2007-8 drought. And said that odds were that the odds of a multi-year drought were very high. They were estimating another 3 years of problems there. The utilities at the meeting, and they came from 7 different counties: Fort Fentress, Morgan, Cumberland, Bledsoe, Ray, Grundy, Sequatchie, complained of a lack of reliable water supply hindering their economic development. The city of Pikeville in particular felt like their reliance on wells was misplaced because they don't know how much water there is in the well. How do I tell some industry that I'm going to be able to supply you when I'm pulling water out of the ground and I can't see it? I don't know how much there is. There were a lot of ideas offered, everything from improving interconnections, which is something that most utilities are trying to do anyway, and a lot of that work has been done in that region, but more needs to occur, to a new reservoir on the Sequatchie River, which raises issues of downstream, balancing the demand between upstream and downstream. If the Sequatchie River were dammed, what effect does that have on in the area of Pikeville, let's say? What effect does that have on Marion County, on utilities in Marion County, for instance, that are dependent on it? So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planners were there and offered several different forms of planning that they could do, most of which involve at least in-kind contributions from a non-federal entity. And there was a lot of discussion about which way to go with that. Southeast Tennessee Development District offered to pull the utilities together to try to develop an agreement among them of who was going to be involved and how they were going to handle that. They met to do that, I believe, in March. And then the rains came. And the only thing that is happening as of today is the Corps of Engineers and TDEC are doing a watershed study. Now, that's not a water supply study as such. It should, obviously, the area, it's in the Sequatchie area, and obviously the area was chosen in order to provide information to further study of what the appropriate water supply solutions would be in that region. But the watershed study itself is an evaluation of the characteristics of that watershed, not an assessment of how much water can be supplied somewhere. So that's where that stands right now. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bernard to pick up on that issue and explain to you what all happened. And I think he has some opinions about the kinds of things that might be most prudent to be done to solve the long-term problems.
Lenise, before Mr. Bernard, let me ask you a question. I'm really surprised, I guess, about the pristine water supply for Memphis. I never realized it was all underground. Is that unique? I know it's not unique with Tennessee, but what about across the nation? Do we have a lot of cities that way that have the water supply from underground?
I'm probably not knowledgeable enough to answer that question. We do rely on aquifers throughout the middle part of the country. I don't know. I don't think there's a bigger city than Memphis that does that. But
That's
wherever you
unique.
can, you are going to rely on groundwater because it is cleaner. The only other city that I know that's notorious for its remarkably clean water supply may not be as remarkably clean as it used to be, but it's the city of New York, and it's not. It's sort of groundwater. They've got massive resource upstate from New York City. Beautiful area that the city and state have worked very hard to keep pristine. But what happens there is what happens everywhere, and why we don't want any more impervious surfaces than we absolutely have to have. The water, the rainfall on upstate New York is filtered down through the land and cleaned through nature's natural processes. By the time it becomes available downstream underground to New York, it has a lot of the things that the rest of us, that we have to take out of it because we pull it from Percy Priest or the Cumberland River or wherever, are simply not there. And so treating the water in New York, you can almost, there was a time when you could almost just turn on the tap and get clean water with this almost no treatment.
Good report. Thank you, ma'am. I learned a lot. Mr. Bernard.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here. Lenice asked me to give you an update. This is a presentation that we've made a number of places across the state of Tennessee, most recently at the Environmental Show of the South in Chattanooga. It is a 1-hour presentation that she has asked me to drop to 15 minutes. So I saw some looks of concern there for just a second. So I'm going to do my best to consolidate this into a 15-minute presentation. For me personally, the drought became first real to me when I received this email from a friend of mine, Dorothy Rader, who works with Tennessee American, who runs the Sequatchie Valley plant that was on that list. And Dorothy put out an all call to basically the entire water community, asking if anyone knew where there was a 500,000 gallon per day mobile treatment unit for a drought-stricken area. I immediately replied back to her. She's a friend of mine, former client before she moved to American Water, and gave her the name of someone who I knew had one of these mobile treatment units. Didn't really think much about it, but that same night I received an email from one of my colleagues in our Memphis office asking about whether I could come to a meeting with Tennessee Department of Corrections due to a drought area at one of their facilities. Unfortunately, I go to bed really early, and so I didn't get this message until the next morning. Gave him a call and said, hey, I'm in Nashville. It sounds like you're in Memphis. He said, no, they're in our office. I need you in here right now. I said, can you give me any background? He said, no, just come in here. When I come in here, he introduces me as the water guru for our company, and immediately they ask, what do we do? And I said, I really hate to admit this, but I'm afraid I don't know where Bledsoe County is. And so I said, can you give me 10 minutes to get my legs underneath of me? You guys talk amongst yourselves. Let me listen. Let me do some research real quick. I immediately go to Google, as most people do, Google Earth, figure out where Bledsoe County and the Bledsoe County Correctional Complex is in lower East Tennessee. As I'm going through this, I'm hearing them talk about options like calling the National Guard in, bringing in bottled water, various other options. Essentially what had happened was they had just received notice from the city of Pikeville, who was their primary source of water, potable water supply, that due to the fact that Bledsoe, as Lenice mentioned, is a groundwater system, 4 of their 5 wells were completely dry. The 5th well was pumping mud, and they weren't sure when they were going to run out of water. Because of that, they had to cut the prison off. Well, as you might expect, it's really difficult to move 2,500 inmates anywhere in the state of Tennessee, and this put them into emergency planning mode. We immediately determined that bottled water was not going to be a viable option because of fire protection systems. Again, the inmates could not be moved, and so fire protection had to be provided to the compound, and we quickly determined that 300,000 gallons per day was the bare minimum that could supply the prison for their potable water needs. I understand that it's part of state law that they have to have showers every 3rd day, and so this was the most severe water rations that they could stand would still be about 300,000 gallons per day. The next topic that was brought up is, well, could we pay a trucking company to truck bulk water into the area? And I began thinking, okay, if I were to truck water from somewhere, where would that be? Turns out the city of Crossville is one of my clients. I know that they have a water treatment plant on the south side of Crossville. Highway 101 Lantana Road runs almost directly from that water plant to the BCCX facility. Made a call to Crossville, said, "You guys doing okay through the drought?" They said, "Yeah." I said, "Would you like to sell another 300,000 gallons a day of water?" And we talked about that. Because we work for them, I also have access to their water model, and so I was looking for an area where would be the closest fire hydrant that we could have this trucking company tie into the water system and get water. As I was thinking of this, I also remembered that there's a South Cumberland utility district, which I assumed was somewhere south of Crossville. Made a call to them. They put me in touch with South Cumberland, who put me in touch with their engineer. I said, "Could I have any files you have, any digital files of your water model or GIS information?" From that information, you see that the water lines are getting a whole lot closer to the BCCX facility. I noticed, in fact, that this green line, I don't believe I have a laser here, this green line comes remarkably close to the county line. Began asking again, where's the next closest water system, and found out about the Fall Creek Falls Utility District. Called their consultant, who also is Bill Donnell's consultant, Jimmy Haley, asked for the same thing. "Can I have your water model files?" They were gracious enough to send that to me. And the thing I noticed was this yellow line here crossing the county line. Started asking questions about that. Turns out there was already an interconnection between the South Cumberland Utility District system and the Fall Creek Falls Utility District system that had never been commissioned. There was a contractual issue that spanned over 10 years, and this line and pump station had never been commissioned. About the same time, I started thinking about Dorothy's email about a mobile treatment unit, and I thought, if I had a 500,000 gallon per day mobile treatment unit, would it help? I texted her to find out if this was the system that she was inquiring about. Turned out it was. And it got me thinking, okay, if I had this unit, where would I put it? So again, started looking around Google and noticed this large lake over to the side. This is the Fall Creek Falls Reservoir. Again, once I had the water model files for Fall Creek Falls Utility District, I saw that they had a water main very close to the state park, and found out, in fact, that there was a water line that went into the state park, that the Fall Creek Falls Utility District was the supplier of potable water to the park. So I was tasked with coming up with what are reasonable cost estimates of what it would be to either truck water into the system or produce water for the system. I was given roughly 24 hours to produce this cost estimate. And the first variable that you have to consider is, how long is this drought going to last? If we only have to truck water for a week, that may be considerably cheaper than treating the water. If it's a year, then treating water is very likely going to be more economical. The best information that we had available to us on this particular day came from NOAA, that indicated that the drought was going to be a multi-year drought, was going to extend at least into the spring. Even as late as December 15th, the National Weather Service was indicating that this drought was going to persist as far as March 31st of 2017 in the area. Based on this information that we had, we agreed that it would be run based on a 3-month needs assessment. Based on that analysis and as much information as I could put together in 24 hours, it was pretty plain that treating the water was going to be a much more cost-effective measure than trucking the water from either Crossville or South Cumberland Utility District. Gave all this information to my contact with Tennessee Department of Corrections, asked, "Do you have everything that you need?" He said, "Well, almost. I need you. I need you to come to this meeting." And I know you guys are very familiar with this building. I'm not a native Tennessean. This was my first trip to Legislative Plaza. And I know as well that you all know these people really well. It was my first time meeting most of them, and very interesting meeting. Governor Haslam asked in the meeting for a summary of what was going on, and also for ideas of what could be done to solve the water crisis in this area. Those alternatives ranged from running a raw water line to the Tennessee River in numerous places, either Dayton or down near Chattanooga, to damming the Sequatchie River. A number of different alternatives were put out there, and Governor Haslam indicated, these are all great ideas, but you're talking about things that are going to take 5 to 10 years and millions of dollars of investment and studies and things like that. We need something that can be implemented in under a month. At that point, the room got very quiet, and I asked my contact with Department of Corrections, Chuck Taylor, if I could speak. He allowed me, and I brought up this idea of producing water from the Fall Creek Falls Lake and pumping backwards through the distribution system all the way to the BCCX facility. Governor Haslam looked at me and said, can this be implemented in under 3 weeks? At which point the representatives from Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation about came out of their skin and said, this has to be permitted, this has to go through plans approval, this has to be, et cetera, et cetera. I said, Mr. Governor, if you guys can expedite that process, the legalities associated with this, yes, sir, I believe that we could have this system running in 3 weeks. And so that was October 26th, which gave me a deadline of November 16th to have this system up and running. During this same time, some of the other ideas, this is the pump station that I mentioned that was built about 2008, 2009, never commissioned on the county line between Cumberland and Bledsoe counties. It was amazing, a visit from Senator Bailey and Representative Sexton cleared up in less than an hour a 10-year battle over a contractual issue, and this pump station was commissioned. Unfortunately, it was only able to supply about 100 gallons a minute into the system due to hydraulic limitations in the South Cumberland system. This is the line that Lenice mentioned, the overland line. There was a farmer, and Leroy Pendergrass, I believe was his name, who offered his irrigation equipment. He had a pump in the Sequatchie River that he used for irrigation of his farms. He ran this line that I know is very hard to see, several thousand feet overland underneath the major highway there and tied in. I thought this was incredibly innovative. This is the wellhead from one of those 5 wells that fed the Pikeville water supply. The Pikeville water plant is what we would call a groundwater under the influence of surface water, and so they have to have those more heroic treatment measures because they could get some of those contaminants in. The good thing about that is it's already set up to treat Sequatchie River water, and so once they had a supply, Leroy was able to get about 300 gallons a minute into the plant, and that was enough to keep the city of Pikeville supplied. How do you design, commission a water plant in 3 weeks? Very first thing TDEC was not willing to relent on was we had to have source water approval. And so I show up the very next day at the Fall Creek Falls Lake. It also turned out this is Jacob Young, the new park ranger at the park. He had been on the job 2 weeks at this point and was directed by his boss, Commissioner Brock Hill, do whatever these people tell you to do. So we jump in the pontoon boat and begin riding around Fall Creek Falls Lake, and I lay out some of the things that we need access to for this mobile treatment unit. He says, as far as I know, the only place that meets your criteria is the boat dock. So we began looking at the boat dock. It appeared to have just enough room to get this mobile treatment unit lined out. Asked if there were any drawings that could tell us anything about the water system in the park. He said, man, I've been here 2 weeks. I don't know where anything is, but I know there's a room full of drawings. So we spent several hours going through every single drawing we could find and found only one drawing that indicated what the water system was. Instead, what we ended up doing was relying on GIS and digital satellite photography for most of the design. We were working very closely with Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. They were fantastic. We were calling them all hours of the day and night and weekends as well, trying to put together this design. And what we agreed on was a very advanced treatment system using state-of-the-art membrane filtration, UV disinfection, and then chemical stabilization for this water to make sure that it met very, very high standards of protection of the public. Because we had almost no information on the water as a source. It's, as far as we know, never been used as a water source. We show up on site the following Tuesday, and no idea how we're going to build this thing, but again, Commissioner Hill committed the entire resources of the park staff to us. We basically just began brainstorming about how to build this. I think my greatest contribution, the lines you see here on the road, is sidewalk chalk that I used to lay out how we were going to build this. Park staff were absolutely amazing. We built a retaining wall in a couple hours. The very next morning, we had stone coming in to level the site out for the treatment equipment. This was amazing. The city of Alcoa donated this tank to me. They're one of my clients. And then they themselves coordinated with TDOT to get this delivered from Alcoa to our site to act as our finished water storage. Turns out that one of the guys there at the park, Andy here, used to finish concrete for a living, and so he did a remarkable job of getting everything ready. This is him leveling out the tank pad for that tank behind him. All this was completed almost exactly as the mobile treatment unit showed up. It had been used for an emergency situation in New Jersey, drove 18 hours straight to get to our site, and pulled up right as we were finishing the fill for it. One of the problems that we ran into was that our pipe layer called the same, almost an hour after the membrane showed up, he calls and says, I don't have any pipe and I don't have any people that can do this. I said, are you serious? You're supposed to be here tomorrow to do this. We called Commissioner Hill, said we have two options. We can either delay for a week and try and find someone, or we can put out an emergency procurement to contractors we know and try to keep this on the governor's schedule. He said, go. That night, my colleague and I put together a rough bill of materials, came up with an RFP, sent it out at 5 p.m. By 8 p.m., we had 2 responses from contractors. By 9 p.m., we buttoned it up with a recommendation to Tina Pennington with TDEC, and by 9 a.m., we had a procurement contract for Garney Construction to come pipe this up for us. Their people were absolutely fantastic, worked day and night to get this all pulled together in about 3 days. Just in time for the pumps that were pumping out of the plant showed up almost immediately thereafter. And this is us finishing up Sunday night around 8 o'clock. The very next day, we had field service reps coming in from Canada, New York, Colorado, other places to test out the equipment, make sure that it would work. We went through a rough training exercise. These are actually operators provided by other utilities that actually work for Jimmy Haley and Associates. So they had 2 days of training on the equipment to get them up to speed on how all of this was going to work. And for the essence of time, I'll just go through real quick. But we had a floating intake that went through a variable speed pump that came in. We did chemical stabilization of the water so that we did not have corrosion in that water using carbon dioxide and lime. That then came into the mobile treatment unit that uses state-of-the-art microfiltration technology. This is actually the same technology used at Murfreesboro's water treatment plant. Came out of there into a tent that had UV disinfection for pathogen inactivation, followed by bleach and lime for stabilization and secondary disinfection, into our storage tank, which was then pumped back through a fire hydrant connection line in the park. Essentially what we were doing is it's sort of like, your heart is at the middle of your body and all of your largest arteries and veins are in the middle. Well, essentially what we were doing was pumping this system's blood back through its little finger. There's a finished view of what the system looked like after we commissioned it. And then this was a pump set at the north gate of the Fall Creek Falls Park to pump water back into the system for both Fall Creek Falls Utility District and the BCCX facility. We commissioned it about 11 p.m. on the 16th, so we made the governor's mandate with about 1 hour to spare. The plant ran well for several weeks, and November 30th and December the 1st, if I remember correctly, was a Southeast drought study that Lenice mentioned, hosted by TDEC and the Corps of Engineers. We had gotten word that there were rains in the forecast this particular day, and so I went and took a measure down on the Bee Creek Reservoir at the Taft facility, and we were about 9 feet down, 20 feet down from the top. You can't really see right now, but 3 of the intakes are already out of the water at this reservoir. The last remaining intake is about 8 inches below the surface of the water here, so they were literally on their last legs on this particular day. However, it rained almost 4.5 inches that night. Most of you might not remember the rains, but I think you would remember the 70-mile-an-hour winds that preceded that, because that's what in large part caused the wildfire epidemic in Gatlinburg, was the winds picking up these embers. That was then followed by this 4.5 inches of rain, which only raised the Fall Creek Falls Reservoir about 6 inches. But when I called the Taft facility, Bledsoe facility, it raised their reservoir almost 9 feet to the point where it was now overflowing the reservoir, and these are those pictures. That really perplexed me until I went into the USGS website to do a boundary of what the watershed looks like. And the Fall Creek Falls Reservoir is a 2 billion gallon reservoir with only a 6 square mile drainage area. On the other hand, the Bee Creek Reservoir is only 60 million gallons, but it has a 60 square mile drainage basin that covers almost 2 counties. So it made a little bit more sense how that reservoir could fill that fast. One of the big issues is that this reservoir is simply way too small. It rained and rained and rained, as Lenice mentioned, and shortly after the first of the year, it was determined that there really was no need to keep the mobile treatment unit at the Fall Creek Falls facility, at the Fall Creek Falls Park any longer, and so all of the equipment was pulled out, most of it sent back to their respective manufacturers, and within a couple of weeks, the site now looks as if we were never there. this thought came to me. I essentially lived at the Fall Creek Falls Lodge for 9 days as we were pulling all this together and building this, and this thought hit me one night, and so I wrote it down. I said, I simply want to thank all the people who helped make this happen. TDEC, TDOC, TDOT, utility companies, manufacturers, even my competitors, all working together for the common good. I might have been raised a Virginia gentleman, but I've never been prouder to be a volunteer. What we did in 3 weeks is astounding. Thank you to everyone who contributed. And this is a list of all those different organizations that contributed. That is the end of my presentation. Lenice mentioned I might have opinions. I always have opinions of everything, but I'm willing to take any questions you might have.
Mr. Bernard, you are a miracle worker, and your volunteers with you. Congratulations on a great job. But the old saying is, wait on Mother Nature, and everything will happen good.
Eventually.
Yeah, eventually. Any questions from anybody for Mr. Bernard? Well, thank you. A great report. We appreciate it. Appreciate your efforts, too, very much. Mr. Jones? I believe you may not be on.
I think I'm on now.
Yeah, you
Sorry
are.
about that. It's hard to follow that. I don't have anything quite as exciting. Lenice asked if I would tell you all a little bit about the reallocation at J. Percy Priest and some of the legal issues involved there. And with a particular focus, at least it's my intention to put a particular focus on some of the issues involving the division of responsibility between the state of Tennessee and the Army Corps of Engineers. As Lenice mentioned, and that was a great overview of the process, we're in the middle of a reallocation of storage, which is the process the Army Corps of Engineers uses when it's going to make more of its storage in its reservoirs available for a new purpose, in this case, water supply. The reason that we're doing it is that we do have contracts in place for CUD, Rutherford County, Smyrna, and Laverne, the other utility that draws from Percy Priest. Those contracts were executed in 2003 and 2008, but it turns out, as a result of some changes in policy and as a result of some changes in hydrology, which is that it turns out that we've had a drought worse than had been experienced as of the time those contracts were executed. And as a result of some errors in the calculation method, that those contracts don't yield the amount of water that they're originally anticipated to yield. And so basically the reason we're going through another reallocation is that we need more water, and the amount provided under the original contracts isn't what was expected. Add to that additional growth so that the demands continue to increase, and that's why we're in this process. There's an element there, you ask, if we had contracts, even if there are errors in it, why do we not get the amount of water that was promised the first time around? And that's a question that has to do with the nature of these contracts that I'm going to explain a little bit. Before I get there, though, the main issues in the reallocation and the process that the Army Corps of Engineers is using right now, we're making good progress. The Army put out a draft reallocation report in December of last year. This is a long time coming, but we're happy to be in this place, and I think the Army, the Nashville District, and its folks are working hard to get this done, so we appreciate all the work that they're putting into it. The main issues at this point that need to be resolved, there's a few things that need to be done. One is that the population growth and water demand projections all need to be finalized. And so the first thing you do if you're going to figure out how much water you need in the future is figure out how many people you're going to have and how the water demands might change, and translate that into a total. So how much water do we need? Those projections start from projections that this TACIR put together, but then because of some updates, that's not actually directly what's being used in the study. From then, you got to figure out how much storage is actually available in the reservoir. So how much water or storage can the Army make available? And it turns out that the storage available for the water supply purpose at J. Percy Priest is pretty limited. All of the Army Corps of Engineers reservoirs that are used for water supply are multi-purpose reservoirs. They're never principally built for the purpose of supplying water. They're always built principally for other purposes, which means that water supply is an add-on. And when it's added in, the Army has to figure out what the impacts to the other purposes of the project are going to be. And so there's always a question about how far the Army can go, how much it can give before it needs to go back to Congress for more authority to authorize this use of the federal project. And even if it doesn't need to go back to Congress, which in this case it doesn't, it's got to figure out the right balance between the water supply purpose and the other purposes of the reservoir. In this case, flood control and recreation. There's also another question, though, that's a big one here, and this has to do with that variable yield of the contract. And so once you get a contract, how much water do you actually get? And it's variable for a number of good reasons, and some of them that aren't so good, that have to do with policy changes, which are points of disagreement currently between the water supply entities and the Army Corps of Engineers. And so here's where I'm going to take a little detour and try to explain the issue. The issue is that the Army Corps of Engineers, when it builds a reservoir, doesn't take control of all the water. It builds a reservoir, but the water remains in the control of the state. This is a hard concept for people to understand. But it's a result of the history on a broad national scale, the nature of water and the control of water has always been considered one of the most important principal elements of a state's sovereignty. States are simply, it's one of the primary functions of a state to plan for and allocate its water resources. And the United States, the states of the United States have not given up that authority. They've never been willing to give it up. This is especially true if you moved from the eastern states, where water supply and water quantity has not traditionally really been a concern, to the west, where it always has been. So if you go back in time to the early part of the 20th century, when the Army Corps, when the federal government started to get into the business of building major water projects, this was a hard sell at the time. And the states in the West, in particular, desperately needed the federal investment because these are very big, expensive projects that can't always be undertaken with local resources. At the same time, those Western states in particular said, if in authorizing the federal government to build a big water project, we're going to cede our control, give up our control over the water in our state to the federal government, we're not going to let that happen. We won't do it. As a result, basically a compromise was struck, which has guided the federal water programs until now, going forward. And that is the understanding that when the federal government builds a reservoir, it builds a structure. It's a structure, it's a facility. It's not, the authority to construct that facility does not come with the authority to take or to allocate the water rights. Those rights, those elements of state sovereignty remain with the states. So you wind up with a very interesting interplay between state and federal authorities trying to figure out in each case exactly what is the responsibility of the Army Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation versus what is the responsibility of the state. And not only the responsibility, but what's the authority? So what calls can the state, in the event of a disagreement between the Army and the state, who gets to make the decision? A lot of these questions are unresolved. In the West, they have been resolved very clearly in favor of the states. In the East, where water rights have not been top of mind in most states, and the water rights systems and regulations are not as well developed, it simply hasn't been an issue until now, which means that even if they've been resolved legally, or even if there is a way to argue that they've been resolved, it's not something that anyone in practice has really figured out. So these are sort of issues that are, these are emerging issues that I also represent clients in Atlanta, and we've been grappling with these issues with the Army Corps of Engineers for some time. Tennessee's now grappling with them. These issues are going to spread throughout the East, throughout these riparian jurisdictions, because the resource that's available in these Army Corps of Engineers reservoirs is becoming increasingly important as our climate becomes more erratic, droughts become more frequent, and water supply is in shorter supply due to growth in population. So we're basically on the leading edge of some very important issues that are in the process of getting resolved. And we here in Middle Tennessee are about to solve some of them, I think. So one of the issues with this split in authority is that the contract that Murfreesboro and CUD and the other utilities entered into in 2003 was a contract not for water. The Army Corps of Engineers is not a water utility, and it cannot guarantee water. This goes back to what I was just saying. What they do is provide a service. The service is to set aside a bucket, a volume of water in their reservoir in which water can be stored. And so the Army says, I've got a project, I've got space available in my reservoir, I can use that space to store your water, and then we'll enter into a contract and you'll pay for the federal government's costs in building and operating that portion of the reservoir. And that's what the contract does. It's explicit in these contracts that they don't guarantee any specific yield. The yield is the amount that you can actually withdraw from the space that you've purchased. To figure out how much yield you can get, and the technical definition of that term yield is the amount that, let's give you the definition of firm yield. If you're a utility, what you need to know is how much water supply can I get during the worst drought I'm expecting to experience. So the firm yield is the amount that I'm certain that I can pull from the reservoir day in and day out throughout the worst drought on record. When you purchase storage space, when you enter into a contract with the federal government to store your water in their reservoir, they don't tell you how much water you're going to be able to get out during that drought. They make some calculations and some estimates, but they say these are just estimates. If it turns out to be different, you get whatever the right amount is, not what we thought it was going to be. And you use historic hydrologic modeling and all kinds of methods to try to figure that out. One of the problems that we've got is that when those calculations were done in 2003, they were done wrong. And so there are just errors made in the calculation. Another is that the calculation depends on your assumption of what the climate's going to be. And they were done before the very bad drought in 2007. 2007 turned out to be a worse case than the assumptions that had been used to calculate the yield of those contracts. And when you have a worse drought, you have to recalculate the yield, and it turns out that you have a less reliable supply. So one consequence of this division of responsibility is that the federal government and the states have different authorities. Another is that, and this goes to the issue of return flows, is that there is in fact a very significant legal question about the rights of utilities when they purchase this storage space in the federal reservoir. Do they get to use the returns, the water that they put into that reservoir? And who gets the right to decide that question? Now, the way that we conceive of it, and the way that every Western state conceives of it, is that when you've purchased the right to store water in a bucket, it's up to me to figure out how to fill that bucket. If I purchase a bucket, I've got the right to utilize a certain portion of it to store any water that I've got the right to under Tennessee law. And if I can find ways to put more water in that bucket, that should be encouraged, and I should have a right to do it. And this is where Public Chapter 220 comes in. Because what I'm telling you is the position that Consolidated Utilities District and the City of Murfreesboro and Smyrna have on the matter. But the Army Corps of Engineers disagrees with us. And the Army Corps of Engineers' position has been that, in fact, when you put water into the core reservoir, notwithstanding this distinction between storage and water and all that historical stuff that I was talking about, that the Army takes the authority to basically take that water, and that when you put it into the reservoir, it becomes theirs to distribute as they see fit. Again, we take issue with that. And one of the things that has occurred just in the last, I don't remember when it passed, but in March, in April, is the General Assembly, General Assembly? So the Tennessee General Assembly did pass Public Chapter 220, which is to codify this position into law. And this law says that if you've purchased that right to store water in a core reservoir, and if the state of Tennessee says that the return flow, the water you put into the reservoir, belongs to you, then that's the way it's going to be. That is the state of Tennessee's decision, not the Army Corps of Engineers' decision. And so the state of Tennessee now has legislation that says, essentially, the return flow belongs to the utility that makes it. This is a very important issue, not only because it determines the price that utilities or jurisdictions have to pay for storage, because if you've got more water coming, if you can increase the yield of the storage you've got, you actually need less storage capacity to supply the same yield, which can save millions of dollars to the utilities who have to contract with the Army Corps of Engineers. But really, price isn't the biggest issue. The bigger issue is self-determination, which is that if you can fit the Army storage capacity into your water supply plans, thinking of it as storage capacity, and it's up to me to figure out how to generate additional water to put in it, I can try to then start increasing and augmenting the amount of water that I return. I can make sure that my subdivisions are sewered so that I can increase returns into the reservoir. I can find water from other sources and make sure that they go into the reservoir. All of a sudden, I have lots of options available to me to increase the yield, even when the storage available to me is limited and can't grow. And that might be the position that we're going to be in at J. Percy Priest very shortly, because there is a limited amount of storage that can be made available, and we're bumping up right against the edge of it. And so I would focus on this issue as much as a matter of self-determination and the state's ability to plan for its own water resources. I'd focus more on that than I would on the price, because the price is important, but ultimately the water supply, I think, is much more important. The next steps on this issue, the Army Corps of Engineers has a water supply, has a rule. So one of the issues that you'll find with the Army is that its program has developed regionally. And so the districts out west do one thing, the districts in Georgia do one thing, the one in Tennessee does one thing, but they're all different. And so these are legal questions, many cases that should be answered uniformly. Not that every decision needs to be uniform, but in a lot of cases there are uniform principles that should be applied across the board. But we find basically arbitrary differences between districts on matters of huge consequence. The Army recognizes the problem and is trying to fix it by promulgating a national rule. That rule is proposed for comment in December. The comment period ends at the middle of August, and there's a number of groups that are very interested in proposing it and commenting on it. One of them is a group that Lenice mentioned called the National Water Supply Association. This is a group that CUD and Murfreesboro have been instrumental in founding. Darren Gore is the vice president of it. It was just actually chartered in the last month. And this group consists of state, regional, and interstate entities throughout the United States We've got Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Delaware River Basin Commission, the Atlanta Regional Commission, and a number of others, some from the Dakotas, who are all interested and take the same view of this division between the federal government's responsibility and the states. And through that group, we'll be making comments on this rule. And I guess I just suggest that it's an issue that this task force might take an interest in, and particularly the issues as they relate to that division of responsibility between the states and the Army Corps of Engineers, and return flows. Those are two major issues that are a focal point in the rules. I feel like I've been talking a long time, and so I should stop. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you for an extremely interesting report, and I'm serious about that. We've learned more about water today I think we've ever imagined we would learn, and it's been very informative. Do we have any questions for anyone on the panel? Yes, Representative Virgo.
So am I hearing that we have a different, it sounds like in the west with the Memphis side, there's an abundance of water, but maybe in the middle, not such a great, and then maybe in the east, we get back to, is that a fair assessment that I'm hearing?
In general, I would say yes. Memphis has access to that fabulous aquifer. The rest of West Tennessee does as well. The population in the rest of West Tennessee it's just not as densely populated. In Middle Tennessee, we have the Cumberland River and that entire system, which seems like it supplies abundant water, and it does nearly all the time. But in times of drought, with the population growth that we have in Middle Tennessee, there's where your problem is. In East Tennessee, in the mountains of far East Tennessee, and on the Cumberland Plateau, they're sitting at the top of they're at the headwater part. And just as Atlanta is, that's a lot of Atlanta's problem, is because they sit so high elevation-wise, water flows downhill and it flows down away from them. So they generally just don't have as much water. Fortunately, the Cumberland Plateau isn't as heavily populated, but it has challenges in relation to serving the population that it has, and seeks economic development that it's having difficulty attracting, in large part because of limited water supply. The part of East Tennessee in between the mountains and the plateau has the Tennessee River. It's not as big as it is in your part of the state, but it's, for the most part, big enough. But still, in times of drought, particularly as you get toward the northern part of East Tennessee, and then obviously we've seen Chattanooga experiencing severe drought. There, the Tennessee River is pretty much enormous, and there's no real question whether they have sufficient water, which is why Georgia keeps talking about looking to that area and disputing where the state line is. So that's going to continue to be an issue. But you're right, it does vary across the state. And not as much as it varies across the country, obviously, but in substantial ways that raise different issues and create different challenges. Cliff may be able to, Dr. Lippard may be able to talk to this a little bit more knowledgeably, but the GAO, the General Accountability Office of the federal government, has been doing a study that I think is going to be released in a few months, maybe, where they were looking at state-level water supply organizations around the country. They interviewed a lot of people in Tennessee, particularly those that were involved with the Water Resources Technical Advisory Committee, and they came to your staff at TACIR for that reason. And they were interested in determining to what extent states had those organizations, how effective were they, what did they do in states that didn't have those organizations, did they have bigger problems meeting the challenges, the water supply challenges in those states. It's going to be a very interesting report, I think, when it comes out, and one that we'll want to pay close attention to. Mr. Jones has mentioned several times that this commission might be a good organization to try to keep tabs on this, because you're representative of the entire state. You are state and local government, and you have responsibility vertically and horizontally over these kinds of issues, and which is the reason that I think Dr. Lippard wanted to bring these presentations to you.
Well, these are certainly very important issues to all of us. You never know when disasters can happen and the loss of water supply
Mother Nature,
with any of us.
Yeah, Mother Nature tends to bail us out so frequently that we may not take them as seriously as we should. But thinking back over Mr. Bernard's presentation, it's hard to imagine doing that twice.
Yes, ma'am.
And the only reason we were able to do it this time is because we had access to state funding, because it was a problem for the Department of Correction. If it had been a problem for the local utilities on the plateau, I don't know how the money would ever have been pulled together, how those resources would ever have been pulled together to solve the problem.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
One follow-up. So what role does irrigation play with the supply of the water? Because we're starting to hear concerns with the wells that are being driven all across West Tennessee for the irrigation process.
Well, I think so far we've been lucky, and that hasn't been a big issue, and it's allowed us the luxury of, for instance, not monitoring the amount of water that agriculture uses, or at least not have the same reporting controls over water usage. As Mr. Jones pointed out, we're dealing with climate variations that are much more extreme than we've experienced in the past. We don't know what they're going to be like in the future. We're also, West Tennessee is big ag country for Tennessee, and the water supply there is extremely important. That is the West Tennessee economy. I think it's, again, going to be one of those issues that the state is going to have to take a closer look at. And I would say that you've got great resources at the state level with the Department of Agriculture. They have people who focus on water supply with TDEC. You've got the 2 districts of the Corps of Engineers. The Memphis district is primarily responsible for the West Tennessee issues. You've got the Groundwater Institute at the University of Memphis to help you understand those issues, and the U.S. Geological Survey. You've got a lot of resources to pull together to answer the questions and help you figure out what the future needs are going to be and what the challenges are going to be and the best ways to meet them.
All right, thank you very much. A great panel, and you folks from Rutherford County in the back, thank you for your support. I know you were going to correct them if they were incorrect. Thank you for coming, to all of you. We're going to move to tab 9, issue that's not really new for discussion, 911 communications funding, and Jennifer Baer is going to make the presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. My name is Jennifer Berry. I'm presenting the draft report addressing emergency communications services funding for your review and comment. The draft report's behind tab 9. We will present the final report to you at the August meeting, and as required by Public Chapter 795, Acts of 2014, the Commission will report its conclusions to the Joint Committee on Government Operations on or before September 15th, 2017. The report was required by Public Chapter 795, Acts of 2014, which was passed to help our statewide 911 system upgrade and address concerns about keeping pace with evolving telecommunications technology. A copy of the Act is included as Appendix A. The Public Act replaced the 911 funding system that relied on state and local fees to fund 911 services with a flat statewide fee on all types of telecommunications services and a new method for distributing those funds. The Commission was directed to study 9 specific questions, which are on page 5, addressing consolidation, Tennessee Emergency Communications Board membership, providers registration, and service interruption reporting requirements and funding. In the next few minutes, I will address each of these 9 required study questions and our proposed responses. The first question I will address is on page 6. Is there a need or benefit to consolidate emergency communications districts or PSAPs, which are public safety answering points? Tennessee's 911 system is operated locally by 100 emergency communications districts, which are also called ECDs. They have discretion about how they operate as long as they meet minimum operating standards. A copy of the minimum operating standards for districts is included as Appendix B. Each district has one or more call centers called Public Safety Answering Points, or PSAPs, that are designated to receive 911 calls and route them to emergency services personnel. Tennessee's district directors are generally not supportive of district consolidation, but are more supportive of PSAP consolidation. They believe that local knowledge is critical to effective 911 service, but they emphasize that the decision to consolidate or not should be a local one. The State Emergency Communications Board, which is also referred to as the State Board, or TECB, agrees that it is a local decision, but does encourage both PSAPs and districts to consolidate, and offers financial support up to $150,000 to each district to assist with district consolidation, not PSAP consolidation. When we looked at other states, we didn't find examples of district consolidation that are required by law, but we did find 4 states, Oregon, Maine, Indiana, and Illinois, that have passed laws requiring PSAP consolidation and have had mixed success. Oregon's law was repealed. In Maine, few savings resulted and more calls were transferred. And in Indiana and Illinois, there has been some resistance to forced consolidation from local districts. We also did not find examples of successful voluntary district consolidation in other states, but this does not mean that they don't exist. The literature on the topic agrees that consolidating districts or PSAPs could possibly result in cost savings and improved service, but there's no guarantee that it will. Several reports, including previous commission reports, recommend encouraging both district and PSAP consolidation, but not requiring it. Our proposed response to this question is because of variation in local jurisdictions and the mixed success of mandated consolidation in other states, districts and PSAP should not be required to consolidate in Tennessee. But similar to recommendations by the Commission in its previous reports, the TECB should continue its education efforts on the potential benefits of district and PSAP consolidation and continue to encourage district consolidation when the local jurisdictions find that it makes sense through the reimbursement of associated costs. The next study question we addressed is, should the board membership of the State Emergency Communications Board be amended to include other stakeholders such as telecommunications providers, emergency communications districts that dispatch, and other interested parties? The State Board is comprised of 9 members, and 5 of the 9 members are required to be 911 district directors or board members. Currently, the 5 districts represented on the State Board all not only take 911 calls, but they do also dispatch emergency responders. The other 4 required members are 1 city and 1 county government representative, the comptroller of the Treasury or designee, and 1 member who is not associated with 911 districts. Other states require other groups of stakeholders on their boards, including service providers and dispatchers. Directors and providers in Tennessee have mixed opinions about who should serve on the board. 38% of district directors who responded to the 2016 Commission's survey of all the directors in the state did not agree that board membership should be changed to include other stakeholders. 24% agreed that the membership should be changed to require other stakeholders, such as districts that dispatch. Some service providers have said that they would like representation on the board. However, some district directors said they think providers would have a conflict of interest. The TECB staff thinks the board is working well with the current membership, but did not take a position on new members. Our proposed response to this question is there is no consensus recommendation on changes to board membership, state board membership. The next question we are asked to study is there a need or benefit for the providers of communication services to register with the board prior to providing service? To comply with a state law passed in 2012, the TECB established rules requiring all wireless telecommunications service providers to submit contact information to the TECB for the purpose of facilitating requests from law enforcement agencies in certain emergencies. And also, beginning July 1st, 2017, all telecommunications service providers will be required to remit all 911 surcharges that they collect to the Department of Revenue. And the Department of Revenue is required to establish registration procedures for the providers of communication services similar to the existing procedures in the Retailer's Sales Tax Act, which requires people conducting business in the state to register with the state. Our proposed response to this question is, since state law already requires telecommunications service providers to register with the state, an additional registration requirement is not necessary. The next question: is there a need or benefit for providers of communications services to notify the board when there is a known service interruption? Although in some cases service providers are required to report service outages or disruptions affecting 911 facilities to the Federal Communications Commission and PSAPs, they are not required to report them directly to the state. Service providers have mixed opinions about whether they should be required to report service interruptions to the state, but TECB staff says that if they were notified about service interruptions, they could automatically reroute calls to a PSAP's administrative lines or to a neighboring district, depending on what the PSAP prefers. They could also work with the district to notify the public that 911 in that area is down and provide alternate emergency numbers. 94% of district directors that responded to the survey, the commission survey, said they support the idea of providers reporting to the state board. While no other states specifically require providers to report service interruptions to their 911 board, 6 do require them to report outages to state public utility boards or commissions. Our proposed response to this question is, because TECB would be able to better assist districts when interruptions occur if they knew about them sooner, telecommunications service providers should be required to notify the TECB when there are service disruptions. And the final 5 questions that we were asked to study relate to 911 funding, and they start on page 9. The funding issues that we are required to address include alternatives to the flat rate fee model, the adequacy of revenue, including whether the single rate fee amount could be reduced without hurting service, who should have the authority to increase the rate, and the effect of next generation 911 implementation on district costs. And I'll explain next generation 911 a little bit later. First, I'll give you a little background on the previous law to help explain the changes that were made by Public Chapter 795 in 2015. Before 2015, the 911 system in Tennessee was funded with a combination of state and local fees. Providers charged and collected the fees on service and remitted them either to the districts, the TECB, or the Department of Revenue for prepaid wireless. Local governments set their own wireline rates up to allowable maximum amounts that were set in statute, up to $1.50 for residential lines and $3 for business lines. The local wireline fees as of May 2014 are in Appendix D. The state had authority to collect a statewide fee on wireless and internet-based phone service, which is known as Voice over Internet Protocol, or VoIP. It set the fee at $1 on each device or service. The TECB could determine increases in the fee up to $3 for the wireless fee, but increases had to be ratified by a joint resolution of the General Assembly. However, the TECB kept the fee at $1 until the law changed in 2015. Public Chapter 795 went into effect January 1st, 2015, replacing the local and state fees with a statewide fee of $1.16 on all telecommunications service that can connect with 911. The TECB distributes revenue from the flat fee to the districts in an amount equal to the average of total recurring annual revenue the district received from distributions from the board and from direct remittance of 911 fees for fiscal years 2010, 2011, and 2012. The law includes a provision that the distribution to any district will not be less than the amount of revenue it received in fiscal year 2012. Districts with wireline rates less than the allowable local fee before July 1st, 2011, could request an increase in their base funding amount. Every district that was not charging the maximum rate by that date, which was 55 districts, requested and received an increase that was effective July 1st, 2016. The law also mandates that the TECB give at least 50% of any revenue in excess of its annual fiscal requirements, which includes the base amount distribution, to the districts. TECB policy says it will give 75% of the excess to the districts, and in 2015 and 2016, it exceeded this, distributing 100% of the excess to the districts. Excess revenue is distributed to districts in an amount that's equal to each district's proportionate share of the base funding. So if they get 1% of the base funding, then they would get 1% of the excess. The first funding question that we address is about the flat fee structure. Is a flat rate communication services surcharge the best manner in which to fund 911 system costs, or should such costs be funded by a percentage surcharge or a different source, such as water service, electric power service, or state general funds or local taxes? Almost every other state uses a similar fee on telecommunication services to fund 911, setting fees at the state or local level or both. Unlike other 911 funding methods, the telecommunication service fee has advantages and disadvantages. The main advantages of using the flat fee method are that it is easily understood, acceptable to policymakers, and used almost universally. And one disadvantage is that the model could become ineffective as technology changes. In Tennessee, service providers prefer a statewide flat fee to the hybrid local state system because it's easier for them to collect and remit payments. A few states use funding methods other than charging a fee on communication services, such as a universal service fee, a sales tax on communication services, fees to property tax bills, special property tax levies, and fees added to utility bills. Vermont is the only state that uses the universal service fee in lieu of 911 fees, but one study by Vermont's Enhanced 911 Board suggests that the state look at alternative funding methods since the current one is not raising sufficient revenue to meet needs. And the other methods I just mentioned are used in other states in addition to charging a 911 fee on telecommunications services, or are used in very limited cases on a local basis, and they're also not flawless. For example, a few local governments in Kentucky have added a flat fee to water bills, but in one county the fee was challenged in court, and the Kentucky Court of Appeals held that there is no relationship between the fee and the benefit received, and therefore the fee is not a valid user fee. Like the telecommunications fee, these methods have their advantages and disadvantages related to revenue generation, the ease of implementation, fairness and equity, their legality, and the long-term stability of the method. Our proposed response to this question is that there is no compelling argument to replace the current flat fee on telecommunication services with another structure in Tennessee. The next two study questions are about funding adequacy. Is the 911 surcharge generating more revenue than necessary to implement the purpose of this act, and can it be reduced to the benefit of communications consumers? And is the 911 surcharge generating adequate revenue to cover the costs of the services, equipment, maintenance, and improvements needed to provide a uniform, stable, and effective statewide 911 system? These are complex questions with answers that vary depending on whether you consider just the funds from the fee or from all revenue sources, and whether you include depreciation and other expenses like dispatch service when looking at district costs. Although Tennessee law clearly states that 911 revenue can only be used for 911 purposes, there is still disagreement over what services or functions 911 purpose should include, particularly whether or not the fee should cover dispatch. Districts are funded primarily by revenue from the state 911 fees, but they can also receive, and they often rely upon, funds from federal, state, and especially local government sources. When evaluating the financial health of districts, the TECB evaluates their annual audits, and considers change in net position, both including and not including depreciation expenses for equipment. Under Tennessee law, a financially distressed emergency communications district is a district that, as shown by the annual audits, has a negative change in net position for a period of 3 consecutive years. A negative change in net position means that a district operated at a loss during that 12-month period, including depreciation as an operating expense. Districts determined to be distressed under this criteria are subject to evaluation and supervision by the TECB. During its evaluation of the distressed districts, TECB staff first removes the depreciation expense from the operating expenses. If after removing depreciation, a district does not show a negative change in net position, it is no longer considered distressed and is no longer under the supervision of the TECB. If after removing depreciation, the change in net position is still negative, TECB staff continues to review and makes a recommendation to the board members about the financial status of the district. The board members then designate the district as either confirmed, distressed, or not distressed. If they are confirmed, they are under the supervision of the TECB. If they are not confirmed, the TECB will continue to assist and monitor the district as needed until they attain a positive net position in an annual audit. TECB's policy for financially distressed districts is included as Appendix G. As of May 8th of this year, 97 of 100 districts had submitted their fiscal year 2016 audits. When depreciation is not included as an expense, just 6 of these 97 districts showed a negative change in net position, meaning that they were unable to cover their expenses with revenue from all sources. But when depreciation is included, 32 districts did not have enough revenue to cover all expenses. Of these 32, 16 had their first year of negative change in net position, 12 had their second year, and 4 had their third consecutive year. Tables 1 and 2 on pages 37 and 39 show the number of districts with 1, 2, and 3 consecutive years of negative change in net position since 2014, both including and not including depreciation. At the February 2017 TECB meeting, 3 of the 4 that had 3 consecutive years of negative change were reviewed. And after removing the depreciation expense from the evaluation, the TECB designated them not distressed. The final district that shows 3 consecutive years of negative change in net position in its 2016 audit will be reviewed and designated either confirmed, distressed, or not distressed at the next TECB meeting, which is scheduled for August 2nd. Appendices H and I show the changes in net position of all the districts, including and not including depreciation since 2012, from 2012 through 2016. Commission staff also looked at funding adequacy in a couple different ways. We created a hypothetical scenario that estimates that the new flat rate system is distributing more recurring revenue to the districts than the old hybrid system. The old hybrid system would if it were still being used in fiscal year 2016. We estimated that $71 million would have been generated from wireline, wireless, and VoIP fees statewide and distributed to the districts in 2016 if the old system was still being used, taking into account the service providers' administrative fees that are taken out. This is not including non-recurring distributions that districts receive, such as grant funds. This is almost $9 million less than what the districts actually received from the flat rate in 2016 from the base and excess distributions. And I want to note that we used data for the 97 districts that submitted their 2016 audits at the time that we completed our analysis, and that we'll update our analysis as those last 3 audits come in. Also in their 2016 audits, 43 districts reported supplementing TECB distributions with revenue from local government contributions. And even with excess distributions, even when the excess distributions made by the TECB are added to the base amount, 63% of districts would be unable to cover their operating expenses and depreciation without additional local government funding or other funding. The inability of some districts to cover all their expenses with fee revenue may be because some fund more things than others. For example, some districts pay for dispatch and others don't, and districts' investments in new technology vary by district and from year to year. TECB's revenue standards list required, permissible, and prohibited uses of revenue, and those are included in Appendix J. In response to our survey, 60% of district directors said the base funding distribution was not adequate for their district, 22% agreed that it was adequate, and 18% responded neutrally. Directors also said that in addition to cutting expenses, they are using reserve funds to operate and balance budgets, and as a result don't have sufficient reserves set aside for future equipment upgrades and replacements. So our proposed response to the first question about reducing the fee is, after taking all of this as well as the continued investment in new technology and equipment by the state and districts into account, it does not appear that the fee amount could or should be reduced. Even if the state determined it was necessary to raise the flat fee rate, simply raising the rate would not be a solution for all districts with revenue shortfalls. This is because the current distribution model favors the districts that are already receiving the greatest proportion of revenue, which is based on the revenue they received in 2012. Commission staff created a hypothetical scenario where every district showed a positive change in net position using the current distribution method, and when including depreciation as an operating expense in fiscal year 2016. In this scenario, the fee would have to be increased 77 cents from $1.16 to $1.93, generating over $68 million statewide, which is far more than the $3.5 million needed to bring the 32 districts that had a negative change in net position into a positive position. When not including depreciation as an operating expense, 6 districts had a negative change in net position, and in our hypothetical scenario, to bring these 6 into a positive net position would require about $553,000. But under the current distribution method, the fee would have to be increased by 57 cents, bringing it to $1.73 and generating $50.4 million statewide. Most systems don't need an increase when you include all sources of funding. Commission staff analysis showed that keeping the current fee and using alternative distribution methods, such as distributing all the revenue based on call volume, using the base distribution plus call volume, and the base distribution plus population, also would not have ensured that all districts are in better financial positions. And under these example models, a few district distribution amounts would have increased, but most would have decreased. In its 2016 report, the Commission suggested that if local fees were insufficient to cover minimum standards, an advisory committee could look at linking distribution of the state fee to cost components developed using technology and staffing operational standards. The report suggested that if the state fee is going to be raised, the state should first determine what 911 functions the fee should cover. This idea is similar to the state's basic education program, the BEP funding formula, which consists of cost components that serve as the basis for calculating the level of funding for each school system, but does not prescribe specific levels of expenditures for individual components. Our proposed response to the question about adequacy of the surcharge is, building on this earlier Commission recommendation, the TECB could tie the distribution of any additional revenue generated by rate increases to a standard set of cost components. The cost components for providing a minimum standard of 911 services could be developed with input from the existing TECB operations and technical committees using minimum technical operating standards and should be reviewed regularly. The method would determine and distribute the funding to the districts, but the district would still have the flexibility with spending as long as they meet the minimum technical operating standards. This distribution method would only apply to revenue generated by any rate increase, not to the base amounts. The next to the last question we are asked to study is there a need or benefit for the board to have the ability to raise the 911 fee rate should there be a financial reason to do so? And our proposed response to this question is there is no consensus that the TECB should have the authority to raise rates without state legislative approval. The TECB can recommend a rate increase, but as under the previous law, the increase has to be ratified by a joint resolution of the General Assembly. 83% of the district directors who responded to the survey think the TECB should have rate-setting authority, arguing that the state board understands the challenges of providing 911 services and that given the authority could more quickly adjust rates if needed. But the TECB staff and providers prefer that the legislature set the rate. And providers stipulate that if the TECB were given the authority to set it, they would want to be represented on the board. Of the 29 other states that levy a statewide 911 fee on telecommunications services, state legislatures in 22 of them set their rates. And finally, the last question, has the expansion of 911 system functionality resulting from implementation of IP or Internet Protocol-based next-generation 911 technology increased or decreased costs for emergency communications districts? Tennessee is considered a national 911 leader and is one of the first states transitioning to an internet-based system called Next Generation 911, or often NG 911. NG 911 basically moves the 911 system onto the internet, so in the future, it will be able to receive text, photos, videos, and other forms of data. Other benefits are added redundancy or backup systems, automatic call rerouting, and data sharing between districts and PSAPs. As of April 2017, according to TECB staff, all 142 primary PSAPs in Tennessee were receiving calls through NG 911, and 100 of those were completely NG 911 compliant. Being compliant means that the PSAP can receive and process calls through NG 911 without having to convert them back to the old analog format. The TECB anticipates completing this transition by 2018. We didn't find studies that examine the issue of whether or not NG 911 increases or decreases costs, and TECB staff says that districts will see a lowering of certain large expenses, and although the district directors are not reporting decreases yet, decreases in their costs, a few did say that although the costs might go up initially, they could save money in the long term. So our response to this question is Tennessee's transition to the NG 911 network could affect districts' expenses, but because NG 911 is not fully implemented yet in Tennessee, it is unclear if the statewide implementation has substantively affected the expenses of districts. We will present the final report to you at the August meeting, and as required by Public Chapter 795, Acts of 2014, the Commission will report the conclusions to the Joint Committee on Government Operations on or before September 15th. Thank you for your time, and I'm
Jennifer, one comment. I noticed that in the charts of the various jurisdictions, a lot of weight is given to population of the district. Has any weight been given to actual calls? And if that district has an interstate running through it, they will get a lot of outside calls other than the residents.
No. So
I think that would
based
be
on population.
I think it'd be important somehow if you could look at the volume in each jurisdiction, because you really can't go by population, in my opinion. You're going to get a lot of calls of folks, Ernest, that passes through Rutherford County that don't live in Murfreesboro. Any questions of Jennifer? Yes, sir, Senator. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm not exactly sure how this fits in, but a couple of things that I've been reading on this front lately refer to the, in this next generation, it's not only do we have to be able to take calls that are initiated over a digital framework, consumers are more capable of sending us information in different ways than phone calls or citizens. So texting, sending pictures, and there's been a lot of stuff written recently about how ECDs across the country are going to have to utilize social media and integrate that into 911. And does that fit into this?
It does.
And so I just was trying to make sure that because that functionality wasn't clear to me through here, and so I just wanted to kind of see if that is incorporated.
It is, and we can expand on it if necessary. But yeah, so through the NG911 platform or network, people are going to be able to start texting and sending new forms of data, and the system is going to have to figure out how to handle that. And that's been a concern across the country as to how all the local districts are going to deal with getting all this new data. I mean, training their employees, storing the data is a huge issue. So that, yes, that's a big part of the discussion, and they're figuring it out, basically. And it's a nationwide thing. It's not just in Tennessee. But basically, transitioning to NG911 is also, it's a nationwide initiative, and we pretty much have to do it to keep up with technology. So yeah, they're figuring out how to adapt to all that, and we do touch on that in the report, and we can add a little more if necessary.
Senator Yarborough, you're right, because I know in our jurisdiction, Cleveland-Bradley County, we've just expended about $300,000 to receive pictures. Seems like anybody wants to take pictures of the wreck, and that's important, but you've got to have a way to receive them. Any other questions?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Thank you. I would like to ask you if you would do an update of your the financial position. Am I on? Doesn't sound like
I can hear you.
Of the financial position because I think when this was done, it was for a part when it went to the flat 116, and then the other, it hadn't been a true 1 year full time there. And then the figures are based on 2012. Is there ever a time that we'll reset that and go back? Because 2012,
Yeah.
I'm not sure those figures are really real figures.
Your first question, we used 2016 audit data, which is the first full year that this law was in effect. So we didn't use, the 2015 fiscal year was half and half.
So you did.
We did not, we used 2016, which was the first full year under the new law.
Okay, thank you. I misunderstood you when I read that
Yeah.
part.
And the second question was?
The 2012.
Oh, yes, that's a great point. And a lot of people have brought that up, that data is already 5 years old. We're stuck at 2012 revenue amounts, based on those amounts at that time. And so that's been brought up, and perhaps that could be a suggestion to use. And that's not something that we are suggesting, but it has been brought up that data is old, so perhaps it's something that could be looked at as well.
I'd appreciate your making a note of that. I think that would be beneficial because I think we do a reset in lots of things to bring it up to date. The other thing is that in reference to what you're talking about over here about bringing it up to date with the social media and the transition, or from just the call, but using all the other ways to notify. And additionally, what's going to happen with their sending pictures, you're going to have more than one person. You have 10 people reporting the same accident. So I think what you're saying, Mr. Chairman, about volume also, applies to that. With that being said, I think we need to look at, and you mentioned that too, about training and the extra cost for training and software and just everything. And I think also along that line, with 60% of our ECD directors saying that the funding is not adequate, I think we really need, that point needs to resonate, because I believe a lot of our ECDs have a situation where they are dispatching. And I know locally we talked with our local police and sheriff departments, and they can't afford to dispatch at the rate that we dispatch. I mean, it's not a viable solution for them to take that over yet. We have decided, as I think most people or many of our ECDs do, to dispatch. But what's happening is you have the funds to provide services, but you don't have the funds, in our case, to fully fund all the full-time employees that we need. Therefore, we're bringing part-time employees on that are filling in for vacations, and we've had a lot of sickness and so forth, but those part-time employees, knowing that they're not going to become full-time, and we've put thousands of dollars into them training, are then hired somewhere else as a full-time person. So we are never really, you know, stepping up on the manning of that station, and I don't think a lot of people realize, the public does. You know, you have to sort of like, it's like Chairman Sargent was talking about in education, you know, with the BEP, what happens there, and I think that was used as a reference point here. Until you've actually been, and everybody here is very aware of what's going on in your ECDs, but until you've been there, you don't realize that 24/7, 365 manning of that position, and what the individual that you have to have that sits there and does that. So I really think that we need to look at the funding. We need to pay attention to those 60% of those ECDs that have said we need some more funds, and not just to give them money to give them money. I think somewhere in here the report says if you do increase, then you do, you know, state how that money can be used. The other thing is locally, we would, last year when we put our budget together, we knew we were going to have to dip into our reserve funds. We knew we were going to be on that chart for the first year. But then there were some of those funds that came to us that were unexpected this last year. And therefore, you know, our city and county governments, we're fortunate that they do fund, and we've come up with, but they're not funding, they're looking at that. Well, you didn't have to go into the red last year. That was not something that we can count on. Those funds are not going to be available anymore as a guarantee. You know, that has been zeroed out. So we came up with a funding mechanism of basing it on what we're talking about, call volume and the usage, and then population. But then you have to have on the local level individuals and funding entities willing to step up and fund it at that level. So we have a three-legged stool. You know, the city, the county, and the EMS, and everybody's got to step up or we're not in balance, and we're not in balance. So, you know, and I think it's awesome that out of the nation that Tennessee is the premier 911 service center, and that we're looked at, and I think that we want to stay that way, and we want to do it the right way, but we really need to seriously look at it, because until one of us has called them, it's like a lot of other things. You want them to be available, you want them to be ready, and you want them to be there. And we've got to be sure that we provide that opportunity, because I think most of us can say that we don't have except someone mentioned Williamson County has, I think Chairman Sargent told me earlier this morning that Williamson County has built a really nice 911 center. Has anybody been there and seen it? I have not been there. I plan to now go visit it. We have what we would call a nice facility, but it's pretty much bare bones. We do what we have to do and try to do it well, and I think we do with what we have to work. I think we do an excellent job in Hamlin County, but we need some more understanding that support needs to be there financially there.
Thank you, Mayor Senator. Those are great observations, and Jennifer, I'm sure you'll mark those down.
Yes.
If there are no other questions, Jennifer, thank you very much for that report. We're going to move to tab
Thank you.
10. And this concerns state prisoners in county jails. This is the draft report for review and comment only. Bob Marrero.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. While Teresa's handing out this handout, I'm going to start with a little news story out of Hamlin County that caught my attention Monday morning when I woke up, that happens to illustrate several of the issues that are facing county jails that we look at in our report.
Really? I'm just a regular guy. Kidding. I'm spectacular.
Actor John Stamos is spectacular, and so is Spectrum. Get Spectrum TV, internet, and voice for $29.99 a month each, with our 30-day money-back guarantee and no contracts.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Brian O'Donnell. We have some breaking news to pass along to you. Hamlin County escapee Dakota Truslow is now in custody. Now, he is the second of 2 inmates who escaped Saturday night after assaulting an officer. Now, that officer received some injuries to the face, but is expected to recover. Let me bring you and show you a picture of who we're talking about. These are the 2 inmates that are now in custody. Again, both of them in custody tonight. Michael Teal was taken into custody on Sunday, and then again tonight, of course, Dakota Truslow was taken in just a short time ago. Now, Hamlin County Sheriff says the escape happened as a direct result of overcrowding in the jails. Now, we're working on getting more information, of course, on how Truslow was captured, so please join us tonight at 11 with the latest.
So actually, they've changed that on me. That update kind of messed me up. But what he said there at the end was about the sheriff talking about overcrowding in the county jail. What had happened was two inmates had escaped. They had been isolated on suicide watch and were left alone with sort of one guard. And I was looking at the update today that there was a fight in the female section of the jail that sort of caused a distraction and led to this this escape. But he talked about the drug problem in the county that was a big contributor to their overcrowding, and talked about how if you would address that, it would take care of a lot of his overcrowding issues. So sorry that it kind of got mixed up. I'll move on and pretend that never happened. So at the Commission's May 2016 meeting, our Commissioner, Louisville Mayor Tom Bickers, expressed concerns brought to him by officials in Blount County that housing increasing numbers of state prisoners is putting a significant strain on counties. These concerns were echoed by the other commissioners, who asked staff to develop a draft research plan to study the topic. In March 2007, the Commission had published a report titled Beyond Capacity, Issues and Challenges Facing County Jails, which it itself expanded on and updated information from earlier reports published by the Tennessee Comptroller's Office of Research and Tennessee County Services Association. So following discussion of the research plan at the August 2016 meeting, which included questions about how the state decides which prisoners to transfer to prison facilities and what the limitations are on the state to contract with private companies for correctional facilities, the Commission chose to revisit this 2007 report, asking staff to determine whether the state, by housing convicted state prisoners in county jails for extended periods, as part of its effort to reduce overcrowding in state prisons, is placing an undue burden, financial and otherwise, on county governments, and determine whether the amount the state reimburses counties adequately covers all costs that counties incur. The attached Commission report, prepared in response to that request, is submitted for your review and comment, and a final report reflecting your guidance will be submitted for approval at the next meeting. Incarcerating individuals who have committed crimes is a central function of state and local government, both for protecting public safety and for rehabilitating those offenders as candidates for reentry into society. The correctional system in Tennessee is split between local jails, mostly county facilities, and state prisons. These jails and prisons are either government-run or operated under contract with private corporations. County jails house most individuals incarcerated in Tennessee, including those convicted of misdemeanors and all those incarcerated while awaiting trial, sentencing, or hearings for probation and parole violations. Tennessee's prisons are reserved for state prisoners convicted of felonies, but for decades we've lacked the space needed to house all of them, and prison expansions have merely kept pace with increases in the overall felon population. Rather than expand prison capacity to meet these needs fully, Tennessee has relied on its county jails to house state prisoners as a cheaper alternative. But where prisons have traditionally been designed to serve as long-term correctional facilities, local jails were not originally intended to house felons for extended lengths of time. As the convicted population has increased, felons are remaining longer in local jails that often lack beneficial services and programs available at state prisons. Right now, Tennessee's 120 jails statewide are 86% full, and 52 jails are each at 100% capacity or above. At the time of the Commission's 2007 report, about 27% of Tennessee's state prisoners were held in county jails, a level where it had been for several years and has roughly remained since. The report included a number of staff recommendations and 2 Commission recommendations, calling for 1, reimbursing county jails for daily costs of housing state prisoners awaiting probation revocation hearings, And 2, setting $35 as a flat daily reimbursement rate for local jails housing state prisoners and simplifying the reimbursement reporting process. Counties are still not reimbursed for housing prisoners awaiting probation revocation hearings. And despite the reporting process being simplified in 2011 and the maximum reimbursement rate having been raised to $37 in 2012, and again, in this year's budget will be raised to $39 for next year, many county representatives continue to say that the reimbursement counties receive is too small. It's for this reason, and because sheriffs and other county representatives have also expressed concern that the process for determining which prisoners remain...
Excuse me, just a minute, Bob.
Yes, yes, sir.
Speaker Tracy.
Thank you. Since you're right on that, I want to hit you with some questions while you're on this subject.
Sure.
You're exactly right. I think, and I'm looking at the list that was handed out. The counties with contracts, the counties without contracts. It looks like everybody's been getting around $37 per day.
Right.
Now I got 2 more questions, maybe 3. One. It looks like if you look at Davidson and Shelby, they get special treatment. Davidson County's contract with the state allows for local sentence inmates to be paid actual cost as determined by the operating cost of the detention center, regardless of housing location within the county without a cap. And the actual cost is $57.85 a day in Davidson County, if I'm reading that correctly. And then you go over to Shelby, they're getting up to $67.46 a day. So I guess my question is, and we've been talking about this since I've been in the legislature, it's a big expense to the counties. Mayor Burgess is sitting beside me, and I represent 5 counties. It is a huge expense. So would you say the actual cost is around $57 or $60 a day versus what we're giving them now? Like we increased this year $2 a day, which, statewide, that's a pretty good chunk, but we went from 37 to 39, but looks like to me they're still losing $18 to $20 a day. Is that right?
Two answers to that. One is that the actual cost for each county is not reported for most counties. Most of them have, after reporting that their costs had exceeded the $35 that they were allowed, were told that they didn't have to keep reporting anymore, and they would automatically receive the maximum amount. So the costs vary greatly from county to county. In Davidson and Shelby County being heavily populated urban centers, you have a number of challenges that they face. It's our understanding that they provide certain levels of services and some higher levels of programming that might not be available and offered in a more rural, lesser populated county. So we have, you'll see, like for Coffee and White are currently 2 of the counties that are reporting their costs back to the department, and they report. It's in the report but their costs are in $42 to $48. TDOC had said in our December panel, the estimated costs for most counties are probably in the 40s. So 57 and 67 are outliers for those 2 counties, but generally speaking, costs are, they're going to vary from county to county and are probably around that $40-something range.
Did Davidson and Shelby just negotiate a better contract or a different contract than the other counties across the state? That's one question. And number 2, it seems like to me, like you said, with the crowding and so forth, overcrowding, that they're staying longer at the jails than they have been in the past.
The contracts are individual contracts. I know Davidson and Shelby both house a large number of state inmates. So just the fact that they've got a lot of them in there has something to do with that. But as far as the length of time, we do know that there are more and more staying as backup that are designated to be transferred to a TDOC facility, but there isn't really a tracking from TDOC as far as how long anyone's staying in backup. So that's part of when we talk in the report about a need for increased data reporting and collecting better information to get a handle on this problem, that's one of the issues that we identified is find out how long people are staying before maybe they are transferred to the prison facility.
I think that would be some good data that we need to retrieve from the counties, particularly the county sheriffs and the jails, to see how long, what the average stay is, and we probably need to know better what the cost is per prisoner per day.
Absolutely.
Bob, I don't want to get you off track of your presentation, but while I'm thinking about it, if a county picks up a parole violator, which in essence is a state prisoner, is it true the state does not pay until the guy goes to court?
Our understanding is parole violations the state is responsible for.
Immediately on day one when they're incarcerated?
Yeah, that's someone who was at one time a state inmate and was released on parole, and then as soon as they're taken back into custody, they remain TDOC's responsibility. It's the probation violations that are not the state's responsibility, because those that's a different term. So if you're out on probation, you weren't in prison. It's not quite the same thing. So that's two words that it's hard. Try to keep those clear. It's tricky for me.
Dr. Lippert, did you have something?
Thank you, Chairman. Bob, just to go a little bit further on Senator Tracy's remark, if I remember correctly, don't the costs also vary significantly within Davidson and Shelby counties? Because those were the average cost across all facilities. Isn't that correct?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, Davidson has a number of facilities. But Shelby, yeah, you have. I mean, the state has a contract with Shelby County Correctional Center, the large detention center, for that's the $67. If there's inmates that are in the Shelby County Jail that are left on backup or in the other facility, they're only getting $37 for those. And the same Davidson. These are the contracts are for the locally sentenced long-term inmates that they're contractually agreeing to take on. So some of the backups, the other, or a facility that they don't have the contract for, they're getting the $37 for that. So it's sort of it's nuanced even within those two counties.
Bob, back to the question I asked. I see the counties are still not reimbursed for housing prisoners awaiting revocation hearings. I guess that's the difference between probation, parole, or...
Yeah, I think that's something that I picked it up when I was doing my presentation that word was left out.
I knew
which
before that question came up. Thank you, sir. Go right ahead.
Yes, sir. All right, so talking about the prison system capacity, Tennessee's prisons do not currently have capacity to hold all of the state's prisoners. At the end of July 2007, around the time TACIR published its report, the state's prison system was operating at 97.7% of its established capacity. In the years since, up until the opening of the Trousdale Turner Correctional Center in January of 2016, the system fluctuated between 95 and 100% of its capacity. Only briefly dropping to 87% when the new prison opened, capacity, that was in January of 2016. Capacity rose above 90% again in February 2016, climbed above 95% in March of 2017, which illustrates that we're right back where we were. At present, Tennessee houses approximately 27% of its state prisoners, roughly 8,000 inmates in county jails. While not the only state to use county jails for this purpose, we do rely on them more than most. And then this time I can direct you to Figure 1 on page 13 of the report that shows where Tennessee and other states rank as far as the number of and percentage of state prisoners in local jails. As of 2015, Tennessee ranks third highest for its percentage of state prisoners held in local jails, behind only Louisiana at 49% and Kentucky at 45%. And we're fourth in total number behind Louisiana, Texas, and Kentucky. 15 states report they don't house any state prisoners in county jails, including 5 that have state-only correctional systems without any county jails to compare to. So in 1981, when Tennessee's state prisons and county jails alike were under scrutiny for overcrowding and unsatisfactory conditions, the legislature passed the County Correctional Incentives Act to provide financial incentives for counties to house non-dangerous felony offenders locally. It was intended to be mutually beneficial for state and county governments by helping to alleviate overcrowding in state correctional facilities, reduce high operational costs, and assist counties in upgrading local correctional facilities and programs. Then in 1989, the General Assembly changed the nature of this compensation, replacing jailers' fees and this additional subsidy with a maximum reimbursement amount for reasonable allowable costs as determined by the rules of the Department of Correction. And each year, the General Appropriations Act sets a maximum reimbursement rate. And by law, counties could then also contract with the state to house convicted felons and could not be forced to house state prisoners sentenced longer than a year unless they do so. So for the most part, counties now receive a maximum of $37 per prisoner per day for sentenced felons and felons awaiting parole violation hearings, either because they've contracted with the state to receive that amount, or for more than 3 years, they've reported costs of housing state prisoners without a contract of $37 or greater, and as such automatically receive the maximum allowed. So then we can look at the handout and see where you have 2 counties that have contracts with the state for a rate less than $37. We have 3 counties with the contracts that receive more: Davidson, Shelby, and then not on the chart is Johnson City has a special contract for a jail that houses female prisoners only. They get $38.75 for those prisoners. That's Johnson City Jail. So 2 counties, Cock at $30.62 and Hancock at $33, have flat rate contracts below $37 a day. So these 2 counties could try to negotiate a higher rate when their current contracts expire, or they could continue to house inmates for the state without contracts, and they would file cost sheets for their reimbursement. If their reported costs were below the maximum, they would receive their reported amounts, and if their costs were above the maximum rate, they would get the maximum allowed, 37 or 39 next year. There are just 3 counties without state contracts required to submit cost sheets for reimbursement. Ray County reports the lowest costs of any in the state at $27.24. And here we have Coffee County's reported cost of $42.80 and White County reporting $48.16. Both of those receive the maximum of $37. So when you take all the prisoners in all the facilities into an average, the average cost to the state for reimbursing counties comes out to $49.36 per day, mostly because of higher rates paid in Shelby and Davidson County and the large number of prisoners they hold there. But there is not enough reliable data available to measure the true costs of housing prisoners in most jails across the state. TDOC representatives have stated that reimbursement likely does not cover all costs for most counties. At the Commission's 2016 meeting, TDOC said that there probably is a gap and that costs vary among counties. The department does not know each county's expenses, and he estimated, like I said, costs are generally $43 to $45 per day. So the average actual cost of incarceration for TDOC inmates in prisons, including those managed by the private contractors, is $76.82 a day. And that itself varies greatly among the 14 facilities. You can see Table 5 on page 40 of the report for the list of state prison facilities and daily inmate costs at each. And those range from $50.32 for South Central Correctional Facility to $167.13 at DeBerry Special Needs Facility. So although the Private Prison Contracting Act of 1986 authorized the state to make just one direct contract for a private prison facility, other laws permit the state to contract with counties that have in turn contracted with private companies. Under the general provisions of Title V, Tennessee Code Annotated, county governments can exercise certain powers granted to municipalities elsewhere in the statute, including powers to contract and be contracted with, and to provide and maintain corrective, detentive, penal institutions, departments, functions, and facilities. And the law then authorizes the Department of Correction to contract with local governments to house inmates as necessary. So according to County Technical Assistance Service, authority for counties to contract with private companies to manage public works projects, which includes jails and workhouses, did exist at one time, but that was repealed in 1988. And so lacking specific statutory authority to do so, counties cannot privatize their jails, per se, but may, however, construct other additional facilities, contract with private companies to operate them, and then contract with the state to provide those beds for housing state inmates. So that's how that works. Although counties use state prisoners for labor both in their jails and in communities, offsetting some need to hire additional jail staff or government employees, Almost all county representatives say their reimbursements don't cover daily costs of caring for state prisoners or provide money for facility improvements needed to house them. And as we said, TDOC's representatives agree. Again, counties are not reimbursed for housing individuals incarcerated while awaiting trial on felony charges, convicted felons awaiting sentencing, and convicted felons awaiting probation violation hearings. So what determines whether convicted felons stay in local jail or go to prison? Tennessee's Criminal Sentencing Reform Act of 1989 made it so that felons sentenced to less than 3 years, or up to 6 in Davidson and Shelby counties, are to remain in county jail in counties with state contracts. Defendants with sentences up to 10 years may be eligible for probation, including split confinement, where they'll spend up to a year in jail before being released to probation. These types of felons are supposed to be in county jail and can also be assigned to participate in jail's work programs. In addition to these statutory sentencing rules, individual judges have much discretion when it comes to structuring a sentence, including how time is spent in prison, jail, or probation. But approximately 15% of the felon population, about 4,400 inmates, are in backup, awaiting transfer to a TDOC facility. They are not intended to spend much time in a local jail after sentencing. Under normal circumstances, the Department of Correction would be required to take custody of state inmates not sentenced to serve time locally within 14 days of receiving the person's sentencing documents. But because of the state's ongoing prison overcrowding conditions, TDOC is allowed to delay intake of felons for up to 6 months. After that, there does not appear to be a clear system to proactively manage the backup population and prioritize transfers from county jails to state facilities. This decision is largely driven locally by the sheriff and jail administrators, who must communicate with TDOC desire to have inmates transferred from their jails. The Department of Corrections says it communicates regularly with local jail administrators and works cooperatively with them to decide which backup inmates remain in the jails. Some administrators see state inmates as being reliable workers since they're serving longer sentences than those convicted of misdemeanors, so they want to keep the ability to work with the state to be able to keep some preferred inmates. So if TDOC chooses to remove state inmates from a jail without discussing that with the sheriff, it can be difficult for the county to compensate for that loss. So while the state is saving money by keeping felons in county jails rather than state prisons, most jails are not able to provide the same level of mental health, substance abuse treatment, educational, and other programs that are available in prisons. Department of Corrections studies have shown that recidivism is higher among prisons released from jails rather than prisons. And furthermore, the state is keeping hundreds of state inmates in jails that fail to meet the state's minimum standards established by the Tennessee Corrections Institute. So one option available to the state to ensure that convicted felons receive access to programs they need and alleviate the burden on county governments would be to increase prison capacity by prison expansion or construction. Another option would be to contract for private prison space, and either of these two options would be more costly to the state than housing the prisoners in county jails. In addition to higher operational expenses, the cost to build new facilities is prohibitive. Prison construction costs per bed reported by states to the Pew Charitable Trust in 2006 ranged from $25,000 for minimum security to more than $100,000 for maximum security cells. Adjusting for inflation, a typical medium security bed that cost $65,000 then would be about $80,000 today. As an example, the construction of the privately owned Trousdale Turner Correctional Center, which is the most recently opened prison in Tennessee, was completed in the fourth quarter of 2015 at a cost of over $56,000 per bed, or $144 million total. And we have on page 16 of the report, Table 1 has prison construction projects that have been completed since the 2007 report. So despite this added capacity, the percentage of felons in local jails has remained the same. So again, we've added capacity and then filled it back up again. In December, our panel described this as backfill, meaning that as added capacity is quickly filled up by new offenders. The state is already making efforts to improve outcomes and reduce the burden on counties through initiatives of the Public Safety Act of 2016 and one of the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services Criminal Justice Liaisons Program. Proactive assessment of inmates as required by the Act will help determine the risks and needs of prisoners, allowing TDOC to direct inmates toward jail programming or, when necessary, transfer them to state facilities better equipped for meeting their needs. This is expected to lower costs for counties by getting the most expensive, highest need inmates out of their local jails quicker, reduce recidivism, ease reentry, and generally improving prisoners' outcomes. Continuing to improve the prisoner assessment and data collection will enable TDOC and counties to work together to target limited resources towards the most effective programs and facilities. County sheriffs interviewed have viewed the Criminal Justice Liaison Program positively. According to testimony from its director at our December meeting, the program diverted nearly 9,000 individuals from jail since 2014 and developed more than 1,200 long-term release plans to help keep those who have been in jail from returning. And its outreach efforts across the state have touched more than 84,000 individuals to assist them in staying out of the criminal justice system. However, only 32 counties are currently part of a criminal justice liaison's coverage area. We have a map on page 49 of the report that shows which of those counties are currently being served by this program. So our recommendation is to improve access to the services provided by this program. We suggest that the state provide funding to expand support for criminal justice liaisons and case managers statewide at an estimated cost of about $1.6 million annually. There should be a balance between operating the state's correction system efficiently within TDOC's financial and physical capacities and the county's needs to manage their jail operations within budgetary constraints. So in addition to these existing initiatives, if the state's policy is to continue to rely on county jails to house large numbers of state prisoners, we suggest that the state should reestablish an incentive program to assist counties rather than simply relying on increases to the per diem reimbursements. The state could offer funding assistance beyond the daily reimbursement rates to help counties implement programs proven to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for prisoners and communities. In some circumstances, this may require assisting counties in upgrading or expanding facilities to allow necessary space for implementing the programs. There are several programs and services offered by TDOC at prison facilities that are not available for prisoners serving sentences in local jails, and additional funding could assist counties with implementing these programs at the county level. An example of this type of program funding in another state comes from Kentucky, which again is one of the other states that has a large number of county prisoners or state prisoners in county jails. They have 23 full-service jails providing inpatient substance abuse programs to over 1,100 of the state's convicted felons incarcerated in county jails. Kentucky's base reimbursement rate to counties is $31.34 per day, and the Department of Corrections provides an additional $9 a day for inmates in the substance abuse programs. Implementing programs and evaluating them would require improved data collection, adoption of standardized programs, and development of measures of program success, which we find in line with the recommendations in the 2015 report from the Governor's Task Force on Sentencing and Recidivism, which was to establish a Criminal Justice Research Council to provide nonpartisan professional statewide research and information development. Those measures should be used to evaluate housing and treatment of all state prisoners, whether they're in a state prison or in a county jail. One other way for the state to reduce the burden on counties of housing state inmates would be to reimburse counties at some point earlier than sentencing, an example of which was the Commission's 2007 recommendation to reimburse counties for holding probation violators in jail while they await hearings. Over the years, legislation has been introduced to expand coverage all the way up to pretrial detainees as well, but this has been considered too costly to gain support. Most recently, in 2017, Senate Bill 678 by Yeager and House Bill 182 by Halsey would have required reimbursement from date of conviction, not sentencing, but this legislation did not advance out of the committee process this year. Adequate oversight and regulation of local jails is necessary for the state to balance its needs for responsible management of the felon population with responsibility to achieve the best prisoners and public safety outcomes. However, neither TCI nor TDOC has clear legal authority to require local correctional facilities to comply with minimum standards established by TCI. Although TCI inspects all jails annually, without the authority to enforce compliance, there's no penalty for a county jail to fail inspection, other than possible vulnerability to lawsuits and court interventions. TCI officials say that their most effective avenue for action is often through their fire marshal seeking a court order when public safety or when safety is concerned. The state could choose, but does not have an obligation to remove state prisoners from non-certified jails. And counties continue to receive the same reimbursements for inmates in non-certified jails and do not have an obligation to dedicate a portion of reimbursement funds towards improvements to restore certification. So we say that to clarify the framework for the oversight of county jails, state law should be amended to give the Tennessee Corrections Institute clear legal authority to require local correctional facilities to comply with the set standards, and include authority for the Board of Control to recommend that the Tennessee Department of Correction remove state prisoners from non-certified jails when it determines that conditions are warranted. Non-certified county jails would not be eligible for the additional funding above the current daily reimbursement rate, and this would provide an incentive to maintain or regain certification and improve conditions in substandard facilities, which is a necessary step towards adding these beneficial programs. And so that concludes my presentation. Again, the draft is submitted for your review. We'll have a final at the next meeting, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Bob. A couple of comments or questions. I'm surprised that to learn today that there are still city jails in Tennessee. I thought counties handle all the jails across the state. I was surprised about that.
They're just, I mean, really short-term lockup type. You know,
Johnson City has one.
I mean, that one's a special thing. But you know, a city might have a place where they take somebody, and then they take them to county jail. I mean,
Just to detain them for a while. And how does the state handle medical payments if you have a state prisoner? Has to go to the hospital. Is the payment made directly to the county jail, or is it billed directly to the state for that treatment?
How it's billed, I'm not entirely sure. The way the medical, I'll have to get back to you on that. But state prisoners, if it's a county that has a contract, then those contracts stipulate how medical expenses are handled. And what happens is usually the county's responsible for about for the first $1,000 of health and medical, after which the state takes over. If you don't have a contract, in a non-contract situation, the state pays for emergency hospitalization only, so any other regular medical care that doesn't require hospitalization falls on the county, which is why identifying inmates with needs, if you've got someone with a lot of medical needs, getting that expensive person out of your jail quicker helps reduce your costs, because that's a medical cost that you're going to bear at the county level.
I understand. Thank you, Bob. Any questions of Bob? Good report. Very in-depth. Oh, Mayor Bickers.
And Mayor Bickers.
You're recognized.
Thank you. Let me applaud you on doing a wonderful report. And since I may have been the one that kind of got this instigated, I've got a few questions for you that have arisen as I read through the report. And I want to make sure when I go back and report to the folks in Blount County that I've got things accurate from what your report is showing. It looks like, as you indicate in the report, that while jails are historically conceptualized as being primarily short-term incarceration places, a year or less, that if I read on page 11 correct, that only 18% of the current inmates in our county jails are convicted misdemeanors.
Right.
Which would typically be who our jails would be conceptualized as housing. Would that be fair?
Yeah, as well as the pretrial, awaiting adjudication.
I will confess that one of the frustrations I've had coming from the private sector into governing is that the state tends, from my perspective, to treat local governments as one size fits all. And the reality is that's rarely true. Our local governments are very different, and it appears that if we digest the data that you've given us, that's particularly true when it comes to the cost of housing inmates on a county-by-county basis. Am I reading that right?
I think, yeah, at some point, that's correct.
And because the labor costs differ by different counties, and it probably does cost more to house an inmate in Shelby County than it does in Monroe County, for example, just to pick two out of the air. And wouldn't it be better to allow the local counties to ascertain what the most reasonable cost is for them and their local taxpayers, taking into consideration a willingness and an ability by the sheriff to utilize inmate labor as appropriate to defray some of the cost of incarceration. Wouldn't it be best to have a policy that encouraged that individual determination in each county, such as apparently is taking place with Davidson and Shelby County?
Yeah, I mean, really what the reimbursement rate that we see is a cap, that's been placed. If you go back to the 2007 report, there were a number of counties that were below what the cap was at that time. So they were reporting their costs were in the low 30s. And as time has gone on, costs have risen. So it was intended to be a reporting of actual costs. And then it's over time, everybody's costs have exceeded what the cap was put in place.
Right. If you're capped at $37 and nothing you do is going to change that, it makes little sense to incur the significant cost of tracking your cost if it doesn't do any good, right? That's just money that's not recouping any benefit.
Right.
What would prevent the state from requiring TDOC to negotiate with individual counties a contract, as they do with Davidson and Shelby County, wherein the state could say you've got to meet the criteria that you talked about that concern some counties, but what would prevent the state from requiring TDOC to, instead of putting a cap or picking an arbitrary number that works for some counties, not for others, what would keep the state from simply negotiating with each county, here's what your contractual rate would be, and let each county make that assessment based upon, the various factors that go into how their individual cost?
I'd probably have to look at the way the reimbursement law is currently structured, that it seems to be that it's designated every year. It's set from year to year, so it probably wouldn't take a big change to make that type of change if everyone were to agree on it.
And again, I struggle with this idea that we got to work within what a statute says, because I would hope we could look at making a statute better if that's what we need to do to make things fair and better across the state. So would it require the legislature to make statutory changes to bring about a county by county negotiated fee, or do you believe that can occur within the current statutory structure?
That's what I'm not sure about off the top of my head. I've looked at it a number of times, but I'd have to see if something was necessary. Yeah.
And I guess one problem could be what happens if TDOC and a county can't reach a negotiated amount, but of course there's no reason the state couldn't put a dispute resolution mechanism in place to deal with that situation, to come up with what the rate should be for a county, is there?
Well, you might still have, what exists now in counties that don't have a contract. There's some rate that's set if you don't have a contract.
Now, the other, and I know Mayor Rowland touched on this a little bit, one of the significant expenses counties are incurring deals with pre-trial felons, right? Do I understand that?
There's a large number, yes.
And the state does not reimburse for pre-trial felons.
Correct.
And as I understand your report, that's been evaluated by the legislature for several years, but the determination was that that's simply too expensive.
There's a number of factors. It is very costly. The length of pretrial and the number of factors that go into how long somebody is in trial. There's a lot of things that go into that.
And I guess there's always the issue about who should bear a particular cost with regard to government. Is it the local government or the state government? But would it not seem more equitable if the cost of these pretrial, of incarcerating these pre-felon pretrial, or these felon pretrial detainees, if that's spread across the entire state as opposed to having each county bear whatever the respective costs are for that county?
I think one of the issues, you touched on it, there are different levels of responsibility. And I guess from our perspective, as we looked at it going into how does, in a county, a sheriff's going to arrest somebody, pick somebody up and arrest them. That's going to be that local jurisdiction's determination, what they're charged with, their district attorney. The judges are going to have a lot to do with when that bail is set or not set. A lot of those things that are handled at a local level are out of the state's hands. So that's where you get a lot of variation in pretrial from county to county that makes it difficult to set something up statewide like that.
And if we do it, by doing it as we are on a county by county basis, does that not sometimes limit the discretion a state court judge has in how they handle a pretrial detainee? Because if there's not space in the jail, they may have to figure out, what do I do with this person, given that I'm already overcrowded with who we have.
That's definitely something that they take into consideration.
The other part of the report that I noticed was you indicate that right now TDOC's method of managing what's described as backup, the convicted state felons that are being housed in local jails, is somewhat a case by case or sheriff by sheriff system. Is that right?
It seems that way, yes.
What would prevent, with the technology we have today, if you know of anything, TDOC from simply keeping the data in the spreadsheet as governments and the private sector does all the time, exactly knowing which jails have which inmates of which classification? Wouldn't that simply require the data to be put into a spreadsheet type system or some other data system from which at any given moment TDOC could say, we need to get prisoners out of this county and we've got room in this county, let's do that. Or we've got room at the state level, this county has the greatest burden right now, let's pull them out of this county and put them in the state system. It looks to me like, given the technology we have available today, we should be able to improve on that, so we're not just doing it on a case-by-case basis and waiting on a local sheriff to call to say, I've got to have relief. Is there anything that you can point to that would preclude TDOC from using a system like that?
No, I think our discussions with them, that we're kind of on the edge of that happening, where the tracking and information, they do a good job of, they know who's where and what they're charged with, how long they're sentenced to, and those types of things. It just, that hasn't been used to the extent of managing the population. And so, like the Public Safety Act, this risk and needs, they're identifying more information about these, and they're going to be doing more with that information. So I think when we've talked to them about, our report coming out now, it's kind of on the edge of that starting to happen, and we're recommending that doing a better job of managing those people is what everybody needs.
Okay. Thank you for your patience with my questions, and again, I thought you all did a wonderful job with this draft report.
Thank you for...
Good questions, Mayor. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Unless there's anything else, yeah, we'll get to that. And we do have some DLC folks with us. Thank you for your interest, and maybe you can give a call to Bob and get some input before the final report comes in. Good. Thank you, Bob. Now, next meeting, August 29th and 30th, I think that's okay with everybody. But when we get to December, it seems like most up here today prefer the 13th and 14th over the 6th or 7th. Is there any problem with those two dates? December 13th and 14th. All right. It's been a long morning. If there's nothing else, we are adjourned.